Listen close, because this is the part they don't tell you about power. The Alpha King, the man who bent armies, who carved empires from stone and blood, woke up to an empty bed and a crown that meant nothing. She didn't scream, didn't slam doors. Harriet Dunvale just left. And that silence? That's the sound of a king realizing his throne can't command the one thing he actually wants. So buckle up, because this story gets brutal before it gets beautiful. If you're watching from your city, drop it in the comments. Hit that like button, and stick with me till the end, because what happens next will shatter everything you think you know about strength. The stone floor felt colder than it had any right to be. Torsten Ashgrove stood in the doorway of her chamber. His chamber, technically, though she'd made it hers through sheer force of presence, and stared at the bed. The sheets were pulled tight, military corners, the kind of precision that came from someone who'd made up their mind hours before their hands ever touched the fabric. The crown sat on her pillow, not thrown, not dropped in anger, placed, deliberately, with the same care someone might use to return a borrowed book they'd never wanted to read in the first place. His chest tightened. Not pain. Kings didn't feel pain. This was something else. Something that didn't have a name in the vocabulary of men who ruled by absolute certainty. How long have I been standing here? Ending. The question arrived without urgency. Time felt negotiable suddenly. Elastic, the kind of distortion that happened in the moment before a blade found flesh or a battle turned. Behind him, footsteps. Measured, familiar. Garrick didn't knock. 30 years as the king's right hand bought certain privileges. The old warrior stopped just inside the threshold, his armor still bearing the road dust from the northern patrols. Neither man spoke immediately. The silence stretched between them like a held breath. You gonna say it, or just stand there looking like I kicked your favorite hound, Torsten thought, but didn't speak. His jaw worked, teeth grinding against words that wanted out but had nowhere useful to go. Garrick moved first, walked past the king, past him, not around, because Garrick had never been the type to tiptoe around discomfort, and picked up the crown, turned it over in his scarred hands like he was examining a weapon for defects. She left before dawn, Garrick said. His voice carried the texture of gravel and old tobacco. Took her own horse, the gray mare, left coin on the stable master's table for the feed she'd used this month. Didn't take anything that wasn't hers. Torsten's hands curled into fists at his sides. The leather of his gloves creaked. Nothing. Not a single God's damned thing. His voice came out quieter than he'd intended. Did anyone try to stop her? Garrick set the crown back down, adjusted it slightly so it sat centered on the pillow. No. Why not? Because you didn't give the order. Garrick's eyes met his, flat, unreadable. And because every man in this keep knows the difference between a prisoner and a guest who's choosing to leave. The distinction landed like a fist to the sternum. Torsten crossed to the window. The eastern sky was bleeding pink and gold. Dawn breaking over the highlands. The same dawn that had broken 1,000 times before. The same dawn that would break 1,000 times after. Mountains didn't care about kings or the women who walked away from them. She made a choice, Garrick continued. His tone hadn't changed. Still that same grinding pragmatism that had guided Torsten through 2 wars and a dozen smaller conflicts. You gave her that. Maybe that was the mistake. Torsten's reflection stared back at him from the glass. Tall, broad-shouldered. The kind of frame that filled doorways and commanded rooms without effort. Jaw like carved granite. Eyes the color of winter storms. Every inch the Alpha King. And none of it had mattered. I didn't give her anything, Torsten said. The words tasted like ash. She wasn't mine to give freedom to. Garrick made a sound that might have been agreement, might have been something else entirely. The king turned from the window, faced his oldest friend, his only friend, if he was being honest. When did it happen? When did I become the kind of man a woman runs from in the night? Garrick's expression didn't change. You want the truth, or you want me to polish it first? Raw. You've always been that man. The warrior's words cut clean. No hesitation. Just the same brutal efficiency he brought to everything. You're the king, the Alpha, the man who holds the highlands together through force of will and the understanding that weakness gets people killed. Garrick paused. She knew that when she came here. Knew it when she stayed. And she left anyway. Because I wasn't enough. The admission came out before Torsten could stop it. Naked, vulnerable. The kind of thing that would get a lesser man's throat cut in the political arena he navigated daily. Garrick's weathered face shifted. Something that might have been sympathy flickered behind his eyes and died just as quickly. Because you gave her a crown instead of a choice. There's a difference. Torsten wanted to argue, wanted to explain that the crown was the choice, that everything he'd built, the stability, the security, the unshakable foundation of an empire that wouldn't crumble the moment his back was turned, that was the offer. Partnership in the only thing that mattered. But the words wouldn't come. Because somewhere between the first time he'd seen Harriet Dunvale in that northern market, mud on her boots, fire in her eyes, absolutely no idea who he was or why she should care, and the moment he'd placed that crown beside her sleeping form 6 months ago, something had shifted. He'd stopped seeing her as a woman who could choose him, started seeing her as a woman who should. The distinction felt important now, catastrophically so. "Get out," Torsten said quietly. Garrick didn't move. "You plan to stand here all day staring at an empty bed, or you plan to rule a kingdom? Both. Can't do both. Watch me." The old warrior's mouth twitched. Might have been a smile on a man less accustomed to violence. He crossed to the door, stopped with his hand on the frame. "Council meeting in 2 hours. Northern lords are getting restless about the grain tariffs, and the Blackwater delegation sent word they're expecting a response to their treaty proposal by week's end." Torsten didn't turn around. "Tell them the king is indisposed. Tell them yourself." Garrick's voice hardened. "I'm not your messenger boy. Never have been. You want to fall apart, do it on your own time. But that crown doesn't stop meaning something just because the woman you wanted to wear it walked away." The door closed. Not slammed, just closed. Another deliberate, measured action in a morning full of them. Torsten stood alone in the chamber that smelled like lavender and something else. Something distinctly hers that he'd never been able to name. Not perfume, not soap, just Harriet. And now it was fading. He could feel it dissipating with each breath, each moment that passed dragging her further from this room, this keep, this life. His hand moved without conscious thought, reached for the crown, lifted it. The metal was cold, heavier than it looked. Beaten gold and iron twisted together, northern craftsmanship. The kind of thing that lasted generations, meant to be worn, meant to signify something permanent. She'd looked at it the morning he gave it to her and said nothing, just stared at the crown like it was a shackle shaped like a gift. He should have known then. Gun. The council chamber felt suffocating. Torsten sat at the head of the table, his table, carved from a single massive oak that had stood for 300 years before being felled to make this monument to power, and listened to Lord Brennick drone on about tax revenues. The Northern Lord's voice had the quality of grinding stone. Monotonous. Relentless. The kind of sound that wore down resistance through sheer persistence rather than any actual compelling argument. "Your Majesty, if we could just revisit the matter of the Highland grain quotas." "No." Brennick blinked, heavy jowls quivering slightly. Your Majesty, I don't think you understand the full scope of—" I said, "No." Torsten's voice didn't rise, didn't need to. The temperature in the room dropped 5 degrees. "The quotas stand. You want to renegotiate? Bring me a proposal that doesn't involve gutting the Western settlements to pad your own stores. But the Western settlements are under my protection." Torsten leaned forward, elbows on the table, every eye in the room locked on him. "As are the Eastern valleys, the southern ports, and your comfortable estate in the highlands. All of it exists because I maintain the peace that keeps raiders from burning your fields and rival kingdoms from marching through your villages. You want to argue economics with me, Lord Brennick? You better come prepared with something more compelling than your desire to die slightly richer than you lived." The silence that followed had teeth. Brennick's face went through several interesting color changes before settling on a mottled red that suggested either rage or a cardiac event. Possibly both. Across the table, Lady Saren, silver-haired, sharp-eyed, dangerous in ways that had nothing to do with physical strength, watched the exchange with barely concealed amusement. She was the first to speak after Brennick's collapse into sputtering silence. "If we're done debating grain policy, Perhaps we could address the matter of the Blackwater Treaty. Lady Saren's fingers drummed against the table. A slow, deliberate rhythm. They're offering alliance, military support, access to their coastal trade routes. All very generous. Too generous, Garrick growled from his position near the window. Man doesn't offer you his daughter and his navy without expecting something significant in return. Torsten's attention sharpened. What daughter? Princess Mirana. Lady Saren slid a sealed letter across the table. 18, educated, by all accounts beautiful, and conveniently unmarried. The implications crashed through the room like a boulder through glass. They want a marriage alliance, Torsten said. Not a question. A statement of the obvious thing everyone had been dancing around. They want legitimacy, Lady Saren corrected. The Blackwater throne is new, built on rebellion and assassination. King Vorenus knows his hold on power is fragile. Marriage to the Alpha King of the Highlands? That buys him stability. Respect. The kind of foundation that keeps his head attached to his shoulders. And what does it buy me? Torsten asked quietly. The room held its breath. Naval superiority, Garrick said. His voice was carefully neutral. Blackwater's fleet is the strongest on the eastern coast. With their ships backing ours, we control every major trade route from the northern ice to the southern jungles. Political security, Lord Brennick added, apparently recovered from his earlier humiliation. An alliance marriage removes Blackwater as a potential threat, turns them into family. And a queen, Lady Saren finished. Because like it or not, Your Majesty, the Council has been patient, the kingdom has been patient. But an unmarried king approaching 40 raises questions. Questions about succession, about stability, about whether the throne will pass peacefully or dissolve into civil war the moment your heart stops beating. Torsten's jaw clenched. The crown sat heavy on his head suddenly, physical weight pressing down on his skull, reminding him of its presence, its demands. I'll consider it, he said. Lady Saren's eyebrow arched. You'll consider it. I said what I said, Your Majesty. Dismissed. The word came out flat, final. The tone that had ended negotiations and battles alike. The council members rose, some faster than others. Brennick practically fled. Lady Saren took her time, gathered her papers with deliberate care, shot Torsten a look that said this conversation was far from over. Only Garrick remained after the others filtered out. The old warrior crossed to the wine cabinet, poured 2 glasses without asking, slid one across the table to Torsten. You're not actually considering it, Garrick said. Torsten stared at the wine, dark red, like blood, like the sunset the night Harriet had asked him why he never smiled, why he always looked at her like she was a problem to be solved instead of a person to be known. He told her that was what kingship meant, seeing patterns, anticipating threats, staying 3 moves ahead of everyone else. She'd looked at him with those impossible green eyes and said that sounded exhausting. It was. The kingdom needs an heir, Torsten said. The words felt foreign in his mouth, like speaking a language he'd learned but never quite mastered. The council's right about that. I won't live forever. And when I die, everything I've built either continues or it shatters. Those are the options. So you're going to marry a girl you've never met because it's politically convenient. Yes. Garrick drank, set his glass down harder than necessary. You're a fool. Careful. Someone needs to say it. The warrior's voice roughened. You're standing in a burning building and you're debating which chair to save. Harriet's gone. That ship sailed. But marrying some princess because the council wants an heir and Blackwater wants legitimacy? That's not strategy. That's cowardice. Torsten's hand tightened around his glass. Careful, Garrick. We're old friends. But I'm still the king. Then act like one. Garrick stood, leaned across the table, got close enough that Torsten could see the scars that crossed his weathered face like a map of old battles. A king makes hard choices, sacrifices what he wants for what the kingdom needs. But a good king knows the difference between sacrifice and surrender. You're not sacrificing anything here. You're just giving up. On what? On yourself. On the idea that you might actually deserve something other than this. Garrick gestured at the council chamber. The throne. The crown. All of it. You built an empire. Congratulations. You won. But you're so busy protecting what you've built that you forgot to actually live in it. The words hit like arrows, clean, precise, finding gaps in armor Torsten hadn't known existed. She made me weak, he said quietly. The admission tasted like poison, like defeat. Every moment I spent thinking about her was a moment I wasn't thinking about the kingdom. Every decision I questioned because I wondered what she'd think, whether she'd approve, whether she'd stay if you what? Garrick's voice gentled. If you were human for 5 minutes? If you let yourself want something that wasn't wrapped in duty and obligation? Torsten didn't answer, couldn't, because the truth was too large, too complicated, too tangled up in the part of him that had learned early, too early, that wanting things got people killed. His father had wanted peace, had died with a blade in his back during peace negotiations. His mother had wanted love, had wasted away after his father's death. Just stopped. Stopped eating, stopped speaking, stopped existing in any meaningful way. Torsten had been 12. He'd learned the lesson carved into his bones by grief and necessity. Want nothing, need nothing. Rule through strength and certainty and the absolute conviction that hesitation equaled death. And then Harriet Dunvale had walked into his life with mud on her boots and challenge in her eyes, and he'd wanted. God's help him. He'd wanted. Find me when you've made your decision, Garrick said. The warrior moved toward the door, stopped, looked back. And Torsten? Whatever you choose, make sure it's actually your choice, not the council's, not the kingdom's, yours, because you're going to have to live with it for the rest of your life. The door closed. For the second time that day, Torsten sat alone in a room that felt too large and too empty all at once. He drank the wine. It didn't help. 3 weeks passed like a slow bleed. Torsten ruled, made decisions, reviewed reports from the borders and the trade guilds and the dozen smaller disputes that required the king's attention. He was efficient, precise, exactly the leader the kingdom needed. And every night he walked past the chamber that still smelled faintly of lavender, and something distinctly hers. The crown sat on his desk now. He'd moved it the second day. Couldn't stand seeing it on the pillow. Couldn't stand the reminder that she'd placed it there with such care, such finality. Reports arrived from the northern valleys. Harriet's farm was thriving. She'd repaired the damaged irrigation channels, expanded the southern fields. The locals spoke of her with the kind of respect usually reserved for people who'd proven themselves through action rather than title. She'd built something without him, without the crown, without any of the security and structure he'd offered. The knowledge sat in his chest like a stone. Lady Saren brought the Blackwater Treaty back to council, pushed harder this time, brought numbers, projections, a detailed breakdown of everything the alliance would provide: naval support, trade routes, political stability. And Princess Marana, 18, beautiful, educated, perfect. The council watched him with hungry eyes, waiting for the decision that would secure the kingdom's future, that would silence the whispers about the unmarried king and the questions about succession. Torsten looked at the treaty, looked at the miniature portrait of Princess Marana, delicate features, dark hair, eyes that held all the warmth of a political arrangement. She would be a good queen, obedient, gracious, everything the position required. She would never challenge him, never question, never look at him like he was a mystery worth solving instead of a throne worth securing. She would never leave a crown on his pillow and walk away before dawn. He signed the treaty. The council erupted in restrained celebration, the kind of controlled approval that befitted men and women who dealt in kingdoms rather than emotions. Garrick said nothing, just stood by the window with his arms crossed and an expression that suggested he was watching a man walk willingly into a trap of his own making. The wedding was set for 3 months, time enough for Princess Marana to travel from Blackwater, time enough for the preparations, the ceremonies, all the pageantry that came with binding 2 kingdoms through marriage, time enough for Torsten to convince himself he'd made the right choice. He failed spectacularly. The Northern Rebellion started small, a refused tax payment, a burned checkpoint, minor resistance that would normally be handled by local authorities without bothering the king. But it spread, faster than made sense, more organized than random discontent should allow. Within 2 weeks, 3 northern settlements had declared independence, fortified their positions, started raiding supply lines. And at the center of it all, according to the scouts' reports, was a farm in the Highland Valley, Harriet's farm. Torsten read the report 3 times, each time hoping the words would change, that he'd misread, that this was some other Harriet Dunvale who just happened to be organizing armed resistance in the exact location where she'd rebuilt her life. The universe wasn't that cruel. Apparently it was. She's not leading them, Garrick said. He'd spread the intelligence reports across the war table. Maps, troop movements, supply caches. The old warrior's finger traced a route through the highlands. But they're using her land as a staging ground, meeting there, planning there. She's either complicit or catastrophically naive. Which do you think? Garrick snorted. I think the woman who walked away from the Alpha King because she valued her freedom over a crown isn't naive about anything. Torsten's hands flattened against the table. Why would she do this? Why now? Maybe she's not doing anything. Maybe they came to her, and she just, what? Welcomed armed rebels onto her property out of the goodness of her heart. Maybe she sympathizes. Garrick's voice was carefully neutral. The northern settlements have been squeezed hard the last few years. Higher taxes, stricter quotas, all to fund the expansion south and the coastal defenses. They're not wrong to be angry. They're rebels. Anger doesn't give them the right to what? To resist. To say no. Garrick's eyes were flat. To walk away from a system that's crushing them. The parallel landed like a slap. This is different, Torsten said. Is it? Yes. Because I'm trying to hold a kingdom together. Trying to prevent the kind of chaos that gets people killed. Those settlements exist under my protection. They benefit from the roads, the trade agreements, the military that keeps raiders from burning their homes. And in return, you take their grain, their sons for your armies, their compliance. That's how kingdoms work, Garrick. That's how we avoid descending into the kind of tribal warfare that defined these lands before my grandfather unified them. The warrior was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of years. I know. I'm not arguing with the necessity, just pointing out that the woman you put a crown next to might see things differently, might believe there's a middle path between absolute control and absolute chaos, Torsten wanted to argue. Wanted to explain that middle paths got people killed, that the moment you showed weakness, showed uncertainty, every ambitious lord and rival kingdom saw an opening. But the words wouldn't come, because somewhere in the back of his mind, he could hear Harriet's voice, that last conversation they'd had before everything fell apart. You rule through fear, she'd said. They'd been standing in the keep's garden, late evening, the kind of purple twilight that made everything feel slightly unreal. Not respect, not loyalty, fear. And the moment they stop being afraid, everything you've built collapses. He'd told her she was wrong, that fear was just another word for understanding consequences, that the strong protected the weak, and sometimes protection required a firm hand. She'd looked at him with those impossible eyes and asked, when was the last time he'd actually listened to the people he claimed to protect? He hadn't had an answer. I need to go north, Torsten said. Garrick's head snapped up. What? I need to see this for myself, see her, understand what's happening. You send me. You send a battalion. You don't walk into a rebel stronghold personally. I'm not sending anyone. Torsten straightened. Started rolling up the maps. This is my kingdom, my responsibility. And if Harriet Dunvale is involved in this rebellion, I'm going to hear it from her. Not from scouts, not from reports, from her. And if it's a trap, then I die. And you become king, and the kingdom continues. Torsten met his oldest friend's eyes. But I don't think it's a trap. What do you think it is? A reckoning. The ride north took 4 days. Torsten traveled with a small guard. 6 men. Enough to discourage bandits, not enough to look like an invasion. The highlands opened up around them as they climbed, vast sweeps of purple heather and gray stone. Wind that cut like knives and carried the smell of rain that hadn't fallen yet. This was Harriet's country, not his. Never his, really, despite the maps that said otherwise. He'd claimed it, conquered it, integrated it into the kingdom through a combination of negotiation and overwhelming force. But he'd never understood it. Never understood why people would choose to scratch out livings in soil that fought them every season. Why they'd stay in a place that demanded so much and gave back so little. Harriet had tried to explain it once. Had talked about roots. About the way the land became part of you if you stayed long enough. Became less a place you lived and more an extension of who you were. He hadn't understood then. Watching the highlands roll past, he thought maybe he was starting to. They reached the valley on the afternoon of the fourth day. The farm sat in a natural bowl of land, protected from the worst winds, irrigated by a stream that came down from the northern peaks. It was larger than Torsten remembered from the reports, more organized. The fields were planted in careful rotation, the outbuildings were well maintained, smoke rose from the main house, and everywhere, there were people, not farmers, not entirely. These were fighters, men and women who moved with the casual alertness of people accustomed to violence. They wore working clothes, but they carried weapons like extensions of themselves. Torsten's guard tensed, hands moving toward sword hilts. "Easy," Torsten said quietly. "We're here to talk, not fight." "Unless talking doesn't work," Garrick muttered. The old warrior had insisted on coming, had basically threatened mutiny if Torsten tried to leave him behind. "Then we fight. But we try words first." They rode down into the valley. Every eye tracked them. By the time they reached the main house, a crowd had gathered. 30 people. 40. More emerging from buildings and fields. Silent, watchful, dangerous. The door to the house opened. Harriet stepped out, and Torsten forgot how to breathe. She looked the same, different, both at once. Same green eyes, same dark hair pulled back in a practical braid, same direct gaze that had always made him feel like she could see straight through the crown and the throne and the carefully constructed armor to the man underneath. But there was something else now, a confidence, a settledness, the quality of someone who'd found their footing and had no intention of being moved. She wore work clothes, practical boots, dirt under her fingernails. No crown, no regret. "Hello, Torsten," she said. Her voice was exactly as he remembered, low, steady, the kind of voice that didn't need to rise to be heard. "Harriet." The silence stretched. Behind her, a man emerged from the house, tall, scarred, older than Harriet by a decade at least. He took up position at her shoulder, not protective, supportive. The difference mattered. "This is Kael," Harriet said. "He leads the Northern Council." "Council," Torsten repeated. "Not rebellion." Harriet's mouth quirked. "Depends on your perspective. From my perspective, you're harboring armed insurgents on your property." Torsten dismounted, kept his movements slow, unthreatening. "From my perspective, this looks like treason. From our perspective, we're organizing communities that your tax policies have been strangling for 3 years. Kael's voice was rough. Northern accent, the kind that came from growing up in places where winter killed the weak and only the strong survived. From our perspective, we're trying to survive by refusing to pay taxes, by raiding supply lines, by threatening the stability of the entire region, by asking to be heard. Kael's eyes were flat, by requesting the same thing you supposedly gave Harriet, a choice. The word hit like a blade. Torsten's attention snapped back to Harriet. "You told them. I told them the truth. That the great Alpha King talks about protection but practices control. That he builds empires on the backs of people he claims to serve but never actually listens to. That's not fair, isn't it?" Harriet descended the steps, moved closer, close enough that he could smell the familiar scent of her. Lavender and something else. Earth. Growing things. Life that had nothing to do with crowns or kingdoms. "When was the last time you visited the northern settlements, Torsten? When was the last time you spoke to the farmers? The families, the people whose grain you take and whose sons you conscript? I protect them. From what? From raiders who haven't been a threat in 5 years. From rival kingdoms who are too busy fighting their own wars to care about highland valleys. You're protecting them from threats that no longer exist while crushing them with the weight of your protection." The crowd was growing, more people emerging from the fields and buildings, surrounding them, not threatening, not yet, But the potential hung in the air like smoke. Torsten's guard shifted, hands on weapons, ready. You have a choice, Harriet said quietly. You can do what you always do, what every king before you has done. You can crush this. Send your army, burn the farms, make an example, rule through fear and call it strength. Or you can listen. She gestured at the people surrounding them. These aren't rebels. They're not trying to destroy your kingdom. They're trying to survive in it. And the only reason they're here, the only reason any of this is happening, is because you've made it impossible to be heard any other way. Torsten looked at the faces surrounding him. Weathered, hard. The kind of people who'd been shaped by harsh land and harsher circumstances. They weren't screaming, weren't threatening. They were just there, watching, waiting to see what the Alpha King would do when confronted with the reality that his protection felt like oppression to the people it was supposed to save. Behind him, Garrick muttered something too low to hear. Ahead, Harriet watched him with eyes that held no anger, no hatred, just a bone-deep weariness that said she was tired of this. Tired of watching him choose power over people. Control over connection. I came here to understand, Torsten said. His voice felt raw, exposed. I came here because I needed to know if you were part of this. If you'd chosen this. I chose to listen when they asked for help, Harriet said. I chose to give them a place to gather, to organize, to find their voice. The same things you gave me, supposedly, when you put a crown next to my bed and told me I was free to choose. You walked away, because that wasn't a choice. That was an ultimatum dressed up as freedom. Accept the crown and everything that comes with it. Accept being queen to a king who mistakes dominance for strength. Or leave. She stepped closer. You don't get to call that a choice and then be surprised when I chose myself. The words cut deeper than any blade, because they were true. All of it. He'd offered her the crown the same way he offered everything, as a statement of fact, an inevitability, the logical conclusion to their time together. He'd never actually asked what she wanted, never considered that what he was offering might feel like a cage instead of a gift. 3 months, Kael said. His voice cut through the tension. Give us 3 months. Let us organize. Let us send representatives to your council. Let us have a voice in the decisions that affect our lives. And if I say no, then you prove Harriet right, that you're not a king, just a man with an army who mistakes compliance for loyalty. Torsten's jaw clenched. Every instinct screamed at him to refuse, to assert authority, to crush this before it spread. That was what kings did, what his father had failed to do, what had gotten him killed. But looking at Harriet, at the woman who'd walked away from everything he'd offered because she'd understood the cost better than he had, Torsten realized something that felt like falling. Maybe his father hadn't failed because he'd pursued peace. Maybe he'd failed because he'd pursued it alone, without listening, without understanding, without building something that could survive him. The silence stretched, everyone waiting, the entire valley holding its breath. 3 months, Torsten said. The crowd stirred, murmurs, surprise, hope. But you send representatives to the capital, Torsten continued. You organize, prepare your proposals, and you do it peacefully. No raids, no resistance. We negotiate like people who want to find a solution instead of people preparing for war. Kael's scarred face shifted. Might have been a smile, might have been something else. Agreed. And Harriet. Torsten's eyes found hers. You come with them. You speak for the northern valleys. You make them hear you. Why would I do that? Because you're the only person in this valley, in this entire kingdom, who's ever had the courage to tell me I'm wrong. And if I'm going to actually listen, I need someone I trust to tell me the truth. Harriet's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind her eyes. Something that might have been surprise. Might have been something warmer. I walked away from your crown, she said quietly. I know, and maybe that's exactly why I'm asking. Torsten took a breath that felt like stepping off a cliff. You chose yourself. Over me. Over everything I offered. And you were right to do it. Because I wasn't offering a partnership. I was offering subjugation dressed up as privilege. But I'm asking now. Not as the king. As the man who let the best thing in his life walk away because he was too proud to admit he didn't have all the answers. The valley had gone absolutely still. Even the wind seemed to be holding its breath. Harriet studied him. That same direct gaze that had always made him feel seen in ways that were both terrifying and necessary. Finally, she nodded. 3 months. I'll come to the capital. I'll speak. But not as your queen. As a representative of people who deserve to be heard. Agreed. And Torsten. Her voice dropped. Quiet enough that only he could hear. That wedding. The Blackwater Princess. Is that still happening? The question landed like a fist to the gut. Because he'd forgotten. In the chaos of the rebellion and the ride north and this moment, this impossible, terrifying moment where the woman he'd lost had given him a chance he didn't deserve, he'd completely forgotten about the treaty he'd signed, the alliance he'd agreed to, the wedding that was supposed to happen in 2 months. His silence was answer enough. Something in Harriet's eyes shuddered. Right. She stepped back. 2 months. I'll be there. Harriet, 2 months, Torsten. Figure out what you actually want before then, because I'm not going to the capital to watch you marry someone else while pretending to care about northern grain quotas. She turned and walked back into the house. The door closed. Not slammed, just closed. And Torsten stood in a valley full of people who'd been prepared to fight him, who now watched him with expressions that ranged from curiosity to pity to something that might have been respect. Garrick moved his horse closer, leaned down. So, the old warrior said conversationally, that could have gone worse, could have gone better, could have. Garrick straightened in his saddle. You planning to actually figure out what you want, or you planning to keep making decisions that satisfy everyone except yourself? Torsten didn't answer, because the truth was too complicated, too tangled up in duty and desire, and the slow-growing understanding that maybe, just maybe, the reason the crown had felt so heavy lately wasn't because Harriet had rejected it. It was because he'd used it to avoid choosing what he actually wanted. And now he had 2 months. 2 months to decide if he was going to be the king everyone expected, or the man Harriet had walked away from because she'd understood something he was only beginning to grasp. You couldn't command love, you couldn't control connection, and every moment he tried was a moment he spent building an empire that would crumble the second his heart stopped beating. Because it would be empty, magnificent, powerful, unshakable, and utterly, devastatingly alone. They rode out of the valley as the sun set. Behind them, the farm continued. Smoke rising from chimneys, people moving between buildings. Life that would go on whether he existed or not. Harriet didn't come out to watch them leave, and Torsten realized with a certainty that felt like drowning that he had made the most crucial mistake of his entire reign. He'd thought the crown was the prize. That power was the point. That if he could just hold everything together through force of will, everything else would fall into place. But the crown was just metal, and power without purpose was just control. And he'd spent so long building walls that he'd forgotten how to build bridges. The question now, the only question that mattered, was whether he still had time to learn, or whether he'd already made the choice that would define the rest of his life. The Blackwater Treaty sat in his saddlebag, signed, sealed, irrevocable. 2 months until the wedding, 2 months until the woman he actually wanted showed up to watch him bind himself to someone else. 2 months to figure out if the Alpha King had the strength to do the one thing he'd never done, to choose himself, to choose her, to choose something other than the crown that sat so heavy on his head it was crushing the man underneath. The highlands opened up around them, vast, unforgiving, beautiful in ways that had nothing to do with comfort or ease. And somewhere behind him, in a valley he'd tried to control and failed to understand, Harriet Dunvale was building a life that didn't need him. The realization should have felt like relief. Instead, it felt like loss, like watching the sun set and knowing with absolute certainty, that he'd spent so long chasing power he'd forgotten what it was actually for. And now the question wasn't whether he could rule. It was whether he could still be human enough to deserve what he'd lost. The answer, he suspected, would determine everything. The capital felt like a trap. Torsten had lived here his entire adult life, ruled from these halls, made decisions that shaped kingdoms in these very rooms. But riding through the gates after 4 days in the highlands, the stone walls felt less like protection and more like a cage he'd built around himself one decision at a time. The keep rose ahead, massive, imposing, a monument to permanence. and all he could think about was a farmhouse in a valley where smoke rose from chimneys and people moved with purpose that had nothing to do with crowns or conquest. "Your Majesty." A servant approached as Torsten dismounted, bowed low. "The council requests an immediate audience. Lady Saren said it was urgent. Everything's urgent with Saren." Garrick swung down from his horse, handed the reins to a stable hand. "Woman treats peace like a personal insult." The servant's face remained carefully neutral. "She said to tell you the Blackwater delegation has arrived early. They're waiting in the throne room." Torsten's stomach dropped. Early. Of course they were early, because the universe had decided that he needed every possible complication thrown at him simultaneously. How early? 3 weeks, Your Majesty. King Vorenus himself accompanied Princess Mirana. He wishes to discuss the wedding preparations and finalize the treaty details. Garrick made a sound that might have been sympathy. Might have been the warrior equivalent of, "I told you so." "Tell them I'll be there within the hour," Torsten said. "I need to clean up." The servant bowed again and retreated, leaving Torsten and Garrick standing in the courtyard as the sun climbed toward noon. "You could run," Garrick offered. His tone was conversational, completely serious. "Take a fast horse, ride for the coast, start a new life as a fisherman. I hear the southern islands are nice this time of year. I'm the king, so was your father. Didn't stop him from being human. Being human got him killed." The words came out harsher than intended, sharp enough that Garrick's weathered face shifted, something that looked like old grief flickering behind his eyes. "Being isolated got him killed," the warrior corrected quietly. "Being so focused on maintaining control that he couldn't see the knife until it was in his back. Your father's problem wasn't that he wanted peace. It was that he wanted it alone, refused to trust anyone, refused to build alliances that might actually hold." The parallel wasn't subtle. Torsten started toward the keep. Garrick fell into step beside him. The halls were exactly as he'd left them, torches burning in their sconces, guards at their posts, servants moving through the corridors with practiced efficiency, everything in its place, everything under control. And it all felt hollow. This is what you need to understand about power, Torsten thought, about the kind of absolute authority that came from being the alpha, the strongest, the one everyone else deferred to because the alternative was chaos. It worked. That was the thing people didn't want to acknowledge. It maintained order, prevented the kind of tribal warfare and petty conflicts that had defined these lands before his grandfather had unified them through conquest and iron will. But it was lonely. Not the kind of loneliness that came from being alone. Torsten was surrounded by people constantly, advisors, guards, servants, an entire court that revolved around his presence. This was different, deeper. The kind of isolation that came from being the only person in any room who couldn't afford to be wrong, who couldn't show weakness, who had to maintain absolute certainty at all times because the moment he hesitated, the moment he showed doubt, everything he'd built would start to crack. Harriet had seen it, had looked at him one night over dinner, some formal state affair with visiting dignitaries, and asked if he ever got tired of performing. He told her he wasn't performing. This was who he was. What being king required. She'd set down her wine glass, fixed him with those impossible green eyes, and said that was the saddest thing she'd ever heard. At the time, he'd thought she didn't understand. Now, walking through halls that felt more like a mausoleum than a home, he wondered if she'd understood better than he did. His chambers were immaculate. Servants had cleaned while he was gone. Fresh linens on the bed. The crown sitting on its stand by the window. Everything exactly where it belonged. He poured water from the basin, scrubbed road dust from his face and hands, stared at his reflection in the polished metal mirror. The same face that had stared back for 40 years. Strong jaw, storm gray eyes. The kind of features that commanded respect and inspired caution in equal measure. He'd built everything on this foundation. Strength, control, the absolute certainty that he knew better than everyone else what was needed. And it had cost him the one person who'd ever made him question if better meant anything when you achieved it alone. A knock on the door. "Come in." Lady Saren entered without ceremony. She was dressed for court, formal gown, hair arranged in an elaborate style that probably took her servants hours. She looked like what she was, a political creature who understood power as intimately as Torsten understood violence. "The Blackwater delegation is getting restless," she said without preamble. King Varenus expected you to greet them personally. I'll be down shortly. You look like hell. Torsten's mouth twitched. Might have been a smile on a man less committed to stoicism. Thank you, Saren. Your honesty is always refreshing. She crossed to the window, looked out over the city that sprawled below the keep. I heard about the northern valleys, about your agreement with the rebels. They're not rebels, they're citizens requesting representation. Semantics! Saren's tone was flat. You gave them 3 months. The council is in an uproar. Half of them think you've gone soft. The other half think it's a brilliant tactical move to buy time before crushing them. And what do you think? I think you made a promise to a woman you couldn't keep as a king. Lady Saren turned from the window. Her eyes were sharp, calculating. And now you're trying to figure out how to keep both. The promise and the crown. The observation landed with surgical precision. Torsten didn't respond immediately. Couldn't, because she was right, and they both knew it. Harriet's coming to the capital, he said finally. In 2 months, to speak for the northern valleys. 2 months. Saren's eyebrow arched. How convenient. That's also when you're scheduled to marry Princess Marana. I'm aware. Are you? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're setting yourself up for a spectacular disaster. You've promised the North a voice, promised Blackwater an alliance. And somewhere in all of this political maneuvering, you're hoping to convince a woman who walked away from you to somehow, what? Forgive you? Come back? Watch you marry someone else and be happy about it? The words cut, not because they were cruel. Saren wasn't cruel. She was honest in ways that most people couldn't afford to be around the king, but because every single point was valid. What would you do? Torsten asked quietly. In my position, with my responsibilities. Saren was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice had lost some of its edge. I would ask myself what I'm actually trying to preserve. The kingdom? Or the version of the kingdom that requires you to sacrifice everything that makes you human? And if they're the same thing, then you've already lost. You just haven't admitted it yet. She moved toward the door, paused with her hand on the frame. The Blackwater delegation is in the throne room. King Vorenus brought his entire court, 50 people, all watching, all waiting to see if the great Alpha King is truly committed to this alliance, or if the rumors about his northern distraction have merit. Torsten's jaw clenched. What rumors? You rode north alone to negotiate with rebels. You gave them concessions. You looked like a man who was chasing something that had nothing to do with strategy. Saren's expression was unreadable. People talk, courts gossip, and Vorenus is a paranoid man who built his throne on betrayal. He's looking for any excuse to believe you're not fully committed to this marriage. So I need to convince him. You need to decide if you actually want to. There's a difference. The door closed, leaving Torsten alone with the crown and the weight of decisions that felt like they were crushing him from the inside out. He dressed for court, put on the formal robes that marked him as king, placed the crown on his head, felt the familiar weight settle, and wondered when exactly he'd started to hate it. Quotes. The throne room was full. Not just the Blackwater delegation. The entire court had turned out, lords and ladies from every corner of the kingdom, drawn by curiosity, by the spectacle, by the chance to witness history in the making. Torsten entered through the main doors. The crowd parted. Conversations died. Every eye in the room tracked his movement as he crossed to the throne. Sat. The weight of the crown pressed down. Familiar, constant, a reminder of everything he was supposed to be. King Vorenus stood at the base of the dais. He was younger than Torsten had expected, maybe 35, handsome in a carefully maintained way. Dark hair, sharp eyes that missed nothing, the kind of man who'd killed his way to a throne and wore the achievement like armor. Beside him stood Princess Marana. She was exactly as the portrait had suggested. Beautiful, delicate features, dark hair arranged in elaborate braids, dressed in silks that probably cost more than most families earned in a year. She looked like a political arrangement, which was exactly what she was. King Varenus, Torsten said. His voice carried through the sudden silence. You honor us with your presence. The honor is ours, your majesty. Varenus bowed. Shallow. The bare minimum required by protocol. I thought it prudent to finalize our arrangement in person, to ensure there are no misunderstandings. The word hung in the air, loaded, deliberate. A challenge wrapped in diplomatic language. I'm not sure what misunderstandings you're concerned about, Torsten replied. His tone was carefully neutral. The treaty is clear. Our kingdoms will be bound through marriage, naval support in exchange for legitimacy, mutual protection against external threats. Yes, the treaty is very clear. Varenis's smile didn't reach his eyes. What's less clear is your commitment to it. My signature is on the document. Signatures can be political conveniences. Vorenus moved closer to the dais. His voice dropped. Not quite a whisper, but close enough that the rest of the court had to strain to hear. I built my throne on understanding one fundamental truth, King Torsten. Words mean nothing. Actions are everything, and your recent actions suggest a man whose attention is divided. Careful, Varenus. The temperature in the room dropped. You're in my throne room, speaking to me about commitment. Make sure your next words are chosen wisely. For a moment, the two kings stared at each other. Pure dominance, the kind of silent confrontation that happened when alphas met, and neither was willing to yield. Then Vorenus smiled, wider this time, with teeth. I mean, no offense, Your Majesty. I'm simply stating what my advisors have reported. You rode north to negotiate with rebels, gave them concessions, spent 4 days in the highlands when you should have been here preparing for your wedding. He gestured at Princess Marana. My daughter has traveled 3 weeks to be here. She's put aside her own desires to fulfill her duty to her kingdom. I expect the same commitment from her future husband. The words were carefully calculated, designed to put Torsten on the defensive, to make him prove his loyalty, to shift the power dynamic in a room where Vorenus should have been the supplicant. And it was working. Torsten could feel the court watching, waiting to see how he'd respond. Whether he'd assert dominance or allow this younger, less established king to challenge him in his own throne room. Every instinct screamed at him to crush this, to remind Varenus exactly who held the real power in this arrangement, to make it clear that the Alpha King didn't explain himself to anyone. But then he thought about Harriet, about the way she'd looked at him in that valley, the weariness in her eyes when she'd said he ruled through fear instead of respect, about Garrick's question, what are you actually trying to preserve? And something shifted. You're right, Torsten said quietly. The room went absolutely still. Varenus blinked. What? You're right. I did ride north. I did negotiate with people who felt unheard, who believed the only way to get my attention was through resistance. Torsten leaned forward slightly. And you're also right that my attention has been divided, because I've been trying to figure out if the kingdom I'm building is actually worth preserving. The silence was deafening. What the hell are you doing? Part of Torsten's mind screamed. This is political suicide. You're showing weakness, uncertainty, everything a king can't afford to show. But another part, quieter, deeper, sounding suspiciously like Harriet's voice, whispered that maybe strength wasn't what he'd always thought it was. I signed your treaty, Torsten continued, and I will honor it. My word is binding. Your daughter will be queen. Our kingdoms will be allied, but I won't pretend that this arrangement is anything other than what it is. Political necessity, strategic advantage, two kingdoms joining forces because it benefits us both. Varenus's face had gone carefully blank. And that's acceptable to you. It has to be, because that's what kingship requires, sacrificing personal desires for the greater good. Torsten's eyes found Princess Marana. She'd been silent throughout the exchange, watching with an expression that was impossible to read. But I won't lie to her, won't pretend this is something it's not. She deserves that honesty at minimum. The princess spoke for the first time. Her voice was softer than expected, cultured, the kind of perfect diction that came from years of training in diplomatic protocols. Thank you, Your Majesty. I appreciate your candor. She stepped forward, moved past her father with a grace that suggested this wasn't her first political negotiation. Up close, her eyes were brown, warm, intelligent in ways the portrait hadn't captured. I'm not naive, she said quietly. I know what this marriage is, what it represents. My father needs your legitimacy. You need our naval support. Neither of us chose this, but we can choose how we approach it. Torsten studied her, really looked at her for the first time, and saw someone who understood the weight of crowns, the cost of duty, The way desire got sacrificed on the altar of political necessity. She would be a good queen, competent, graceful, everything the position required. And she would never be Harriet. The thought arrived with devastating clarity, because Harriet had walked away rather than accept a crown offered without choice, had valued her autonomy more than security, had looked at everything Torsten represented, and decided she'd rather build a life that mattered to her than rule a kingdom that didn't. And Princess Marana was here precisely because she understood duty over desire. The comparison felt cruel, not to Marana. She was doing exactly what her position required, what she'd been raised to do, cruel to himself. Because he was standing in his own throne room, agreeing to marry a woman he respected but didn't love, while the woman he actually wanted was in a Highland Valley building a life without him. "The wedding will proceed as planned," Torsten said. His voice was steady. "Gave away nothing. 2 months. Time enough for proper preparations." "Excellent." Varenus's smile was sharp. "Then perhaps we can discuss the specifics of the naval deployment. I have maps in my chambers showing the optimal positioning for later." Torsten stood. The gesture dismissed the entire assembly. "I need time to review the northern situation. We'll reconvene tomorrow to finalize military arrangements." "But your Majesty." "Tomorrow, Varenus." The word came out flat. Final. The tone that had ended negotiations and battles alike. For a moment, Varenus looked like he might argue. Then he bowed. Shallow, perfunctory. "As you wish, Your Majesty." The crowd began to disperse, conversations resuming, the normal rhythms of court life reasserting themselves. Princess Marana remained. She waited until most of the room had cleared before speaking. "May I ask you something, Your Majesty?" "Of course." "The woman in the north." Her eyes were direct, unflinching. "The one you rode to see. Do you love her?" The question hit like a blade. Torsten could have lied, should have lied. Political survival depended on maintaining certain fictions. But looking at this young woman who'd agreed to marry a stranger because her kingdom required it, who understood duty intimately enough to ask the question despite knowing the answer would hurt, he couldn't. Yes, the word fell into the space between them. Simple, devastating, true. Marana nodded slowly. "Does she love you?" "I don't know." Torsten's throat felt tight. She walked away. "So maybe not. Or maybe she did, and that's why she had to leave. Because you couldn't give her what she needed." "No, I could have. I just didn't understand what that was until she was gone." The princess was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was gentle. "I won't ask you to love me. I know that's not what this is. But I will ask for respect, for honesty, for the understanding that I'm giving up my freedom just as much as you are. You have it, all of it. Then that's enough." Marana turned to leave, paused. "One more thing, Your Majesty. If you figure out what you actually want before the wedding, if there's any chance you might choose differently, please tell me. I'd rather know now than spend my life married to a man who wishes I was someone else." She left before he could respond. The throne room emptied, leaving Torsten alone with the crown and the slow-growing understanding that he'd just committed himself to a future he didn't want, for a kingdom that increasingly felt like a cage, while the woman who'd made him question everything prepared to return and watch him make the wrong choice. Again. The next 6 weeks were brutal. Torsten ruled, made decisions, negotiated with Varenus over military deployments and trade agreements, oversaw wedding preparations that felt less like celebration and more like the construction of an elaborate trap. The Northern Valleys sent reports. Kyle was organizing, gathering representatives, preparing proposals for the council, and Harriet was at the center of it, not leading. The reports were clear on that, but facilitating, translating between Highland pragmatism and political necessity, building bridges between communities that had spent generations isolated and suspicious of central authority. She was good at it, better than good. She had a gift for making people feel heard, for finding common ground, for turning conflict into conversation, everything Torsten had failed to do. The observation sat in his chest like a stone. Garrick found him one evening in the war room, maps spread across the table, troop deployments, supply lines, the endless logistics of maintaining an empire. "You're avoiding the wedding planning," the old warrior observed. I have people for that. Saren says you've refused to make any decisions about the ceremony. Won't choose flowers. Won't approve the guest list. Won't even discuss where you want the binding to take place. It doesn't matter. It matters to Marana. Garrick poured wine, slid a glass across the table. Girls trying to make the best of a bad situation. Least you could do is pretend to care. I do care. Torsten didn't touch the wine, just stared at the maps like they held answers. She deserves better than this. Better than a husband who's going through the motions. Then don't marry her. I have to. Why? The question landed like a fist. Torsten looked up, met Garrick's steady gaze. Because that's what being king requires. Because the alliance matters. Because backing out now would humiliate her. Destroy the treaty. Make me look weak and indecisive. So you're going to be strong and decisive while marrying someone you don't love. Yes. That's not strength. That's cowardice. The word cut. Torsten's hands flattened against the table. His voice came out low. Dangerous. Careful, old friend. Someone needs to say it. Garrick didn't flinch, didn't back down. You're about to make the biggest mistake of your life because you're too proud to admit you were wrong, too afraid to choose what you actually want instead of what you think you're supposed to want. And what do I want? You know damn well what you want. You've known since the moment she walked away. The warrior's voice roughened. You want Harriet, want the life she offered, the partnership, the challenge, the woman who looked at your crown and decided she'd rather have her freedom. I can't have that in the kingdom. Who told you that? My father, my grandfather. Every king who came before me. You don't build empires by choosing personal happiness over duty. Your father died miserable and alone. Garrick's words were brutal, efficient, built an empire that crumbled within a generation because he'd sacrificed everything human about himself in the pursuit of control. That's the legacy you're so desperate to preserve. That's not fair, isn't it? Show me one thing your father built that lasted because people loved it. One alliance that held because of loyalty instead of fear. One relationship that survived his death. Torsten couldn't, because they both knew the answer. His father had been a great king, powerful, respected, feared. And when he died, the kingdom had nearly torn itself apart in succession, conflicts because he'd never built anything that could stand without him. Torsten had spent 20 years trying to do better, trying to create something permanent, stable, unshakable, and he was doing it the exact same way, through control, through fear, through the absolute certainty that he knew better than everyone else. The wedding is in 6 weeks, Torsten said quietly. Harriet will be here in 4. I've made my choice. Have you? Or are you just making the same choice your father would have made and calling it yours? The old warrior left, taking the wine with him, leaving Torsten alone with maps that showed an empire he'd built but couldn't quite remember why he wanted. Harriet arrived on a Tuesday. No fanfare, no ceremony, just a small group of riders coming through the north gate in the early afternoon. Torsten watched from the keep. He shouldn't have been there, had a dozen other responsibilities. Meetings with Voronus, wedding preparations, the endless demands of ruling. But he stood at the window and watched her dismount. She looked exactly the same, work clothes, practical boots, hair in that familiar braid. No crown, never a crown. Kael was with her, and a dozen others. Representatives from the northern valleys, farmers and craftsmen and people who'd probably never been to the capital before. They looked out of place among the polished stone and formal guards, and somehow more real because of it. Lady Saren was there to greet them. Torsten couldn't hear the conversation from this distance, but he could see Harriet's posture, the way she carried herself, confident but not arrogant, present without being aggressive. She'd changed. Not dramatically, not in ways that would be obvious to someone who didn't know her. But there was a settledness now. A quality of someone who'd found their footing and had no intention of being moved. She'd built a life. Without him. Without the crown. Without any of the security he'd offered. And she was thriving. The observation should have felt like vindication, proof that he'd been right to let her go, that she was better off without him. Instead, it felt like loss. Like watching something precious slip through his fingers while he stood paralyzed by the weight of responsibility. Your Majesty. A servant appeared at his elbow. The northern delegation has been settled in the East Wing. Lady Saren requests your presence for the formal welcome. Torsten didn't move immediately, just stood at the window watching as Harriet disappeared into the keep, into his world, his domain, the place he'd spent 20 years building into an empire. And all he could think was how much smaller it felt now that she was back. The formal welcome was exactly as awkward as expected. The entire court turned out, lords and ladies dressed in their finest. Curious, judgmental, ready to watch the northern delegation stumble through protocols they'd never learned. But Harriet didn't stumble. She stood beside Kael at the base of the dais and met Torsten's eyes with that same direct gaze that had always made him feel seen in ways that were both terrifying and necessary. "Your Majesty," she said. Her voice was steady, formal. "We come as representatives of the Northern Valleys, to speak for communities who seek voice in the decisions that affect their lives." Torsten's throat felt tight. Every eye in the room was on them, watching, measuring, looking for any sign of weakness or favoritism. "Welcome," he managed. His voice came out steadier than he felt. "The Crown recognizes your petition. You will be given audience before the full council. We appreciate your hospitality." The exchange was perfectly formal, perfectly appropriate, and it felt like glass. Sharp, fragile, one wrong word away from shattering. The crowd dispersed, conversations resuming, the normal rhythms of court life reasserting themselves. But Harriet remained, waited until most of the room had cleared before speaking. "You look tired," she said quietly. "It's been a long 6 weeks. I can imagine." Her eyes flicked to the crown on his head. "How's the wedding planning going?" The question landed like a blade. "Fine. Everything's on schedule." "Good. That's good." The silence stretched between them, all the things they weren't saying taking up more space than words. "I meant what I said," Torsten finally spoke. "About listening, about giving the Northern Valleys representation." "I know." Harriet's expression was unreadable. "That's why I came, just for that. What else would there be?" The words cut deeper than any blade. Because she was right. What else could there be? He was getting married in 4 weeks. To someone else. To a princess who understood duty and didn't ask for love. And Harriet was here as a representative. Nothing more. The fact that his chest felt like it was caving in didn't change the reality. "I should go," Harriet said. "The delegation needs to prepare for tomorrow's council meeting." "Of course." She turned to leave. Torsten's voice stopped her. "Harriet?" She paused, looked back. "I'm glad you came." For a moment, just a moment, something flickered in her eyes. Something that might have been pain, might have been regret. Then it was gone. "I promised I would," she said simply, "and I keep my promises." Unlike some people, the unspoken words hung in the air. She left. And Torsten stood in the throne room that suddenly felt too large and too empty all at once. The crown pressed down, heavy, constant, a reminder of everything he'd chosen and everything he'd lost. The council meeting the next day was brutal. The Northern representatives presented their case. Detailed proposals about tax reduction, local governance, the right to have input on policies that affected their communities. It was reasonable, well-researched, exactly the kind of thoughtful approach that should have been met with serious consideration. Instead, it was met with hostility. Lord Brennick spoke first, his voice dripping with contempt. "You come to the capital and demand concessions. Demand rights you haven't earned. The northern settlements exist under the king's protection. They benefit from roads and trade and military security, and now they want to dictate terms." "We're not dictating." Kael's voice was level. "We're requesting representation, the same rights granted to the southern provinces. The southern provinces earned those rights through centuries of loyalty, through sacrifice, through proving their worth to the crown." Brennick's jowls quivered. "You've proven nothing except your willingness to harbor rebels and threaten stability." "We threaten nothing." Harriet spoke for the first time. Her voice cut through the growing tension. "We organized. We prepared proposals. We came here peacefully because the king gave his word we would be heard." "And you have been heard!" Lady Saren's tone was ice. "Now you can return north with the understanding that the crown will consider your petition. Consider isn't enough. Kael leaned forward. We need commitments, timelines, actual changes. You need to remember your place. Brennick's face was red. You're farmers, laborers. You don't make demands of the Alpha King. The room erupted, voices rising, arguments overlapping, the careful civility of court politics dissolving into something uglier. And Torsten sat on the throne and watched it happen. Watched as everything he'd promised Harriet, that they would be heard, that their voices mattered, collapsed into exactly what she'd predicted. Control masquerading as protection, fear disguised as strength. The same patterns his father had established, the same mistakes Torsten had sworn he wouldn't repeat. Enough. His voice didn't rise, didn't need to. The room went silent. Every eye turned to the throne. The northern delegation came in good faith, Torsten said. His tone was flat, absolute. They were promised an audience, promised consideration, not dismissal, not contempt. Your Majesty, Brennick started. I wasn't finished. The temperature dropped. Lord Brennick, your family has held the Highland estates for 4 generations. You've grown wealthy on the backs of farmers who work land you've never touched. You live in comfort while they struggle with quotas you helped establish. So when you speak about earning rights through loyalty, remember that their sweat built the wealth you enjoy. Brennick's mouth opened, closed. No sound emerged. Torsten's attention shifted to the full council. We will implement a trial program. 6 months. The Northern Valleys will have representation on this council. 1 seat. Rotating quarterly to ensure multiple voices are heard. Your Majesty, Lady Saren said carefully, that sets a dangerous precedent. If we give the Northern Valleys representation, every region will demand the same. Good. Let them. Torsten leaned forward. Because maybe that's exactly what this kingdom needs. Maybe instead of maintaining control through fear, we build something that actually earns loyalty. The silence was absolute. No one moved. No one spoke. Because the Alpha King had just admitted uncertainty, had just suggested that maybe, the system they'd all benefited from wasn't actually working. The meeting adjourned shortly after. Lords and ladies filing out with expressions ranging from shock to calculation to barely concealed fury. The northern delegation remained. Kael spoke first. His voice was rough with something that might have been respect. That was unexpected, Your Majesty. It was overdue. Torsten descended from the throne. I gave you my word. I intend to keep it, even if it costs you politically, especially then, because what's the point of power if all it does is maintain itself? Harriet was watching him, that same direct gaze, seeing things he'd rather keep hidden. Can I speak with you? She said quietly. Alone. Torsten nodded. Kael and the others left, filing out of the council chamber with curious looks but no questions, leaving Torsten and Harriet alone for the first time since she'd arrived. The silence stretched, neither of them quite sure how to start. Finally, Harriet spoke. What you did in there, standing up to your own counsel, admitting you might be wrong. Her voice was soft, wondering. That took courage. Or stupidity. I just undermined my own authority in front of the entire court. No. You showed them that strength doesn't always mean being immovable. Sometimes it means being willing to change. Torsten wanted to believe that, wanted to think that what he'd done was right instead of reckless. But the weight of the crown reminded him of the cost. The wedding is in 3 weeks, he said. The words felt like confession, like admitting defeat. I know. Marana is a good woman. She doesn't deserve a husband who wishes she was someone else. No, she doesn't. But that's what she's getting, because I'm too much of a coward to choose what I actually want. The admission hung in the air, raw, exposed, everything a king wasn't supposed to say. Harriet took a step closer. What do you want, Torsten? You know what I want. Say it. I want you. I want the life you offered before I was too blind to see it. I want partnership instead of possession. I want someone who challenges me instead of obeying. I want... You can't have me in the kingdom. Her voice was gentle, devastating. You made that clear when you signed that treaty. I know. So what are we doing here? What's the point of this conversation? I don't know. Torsten's hands curled into fists at his sides. Maybe I just needed you to know. That choosing duty over you is killing me. That every day I spend preparing for that wedding is a reminder that I'm about to make the worst mistake of my life. But you're going to do it anyway. Yes, because that's what being king requires. Yes. Harriet was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. Then I can't be here for it. Can't watch you marry her. Can't pretend that duty is more important than actually being human. I understand. Do you? Because I don't think you do. I don't think you understand that choosing that crown over everything else isn't strength. It's surrender. It's giving up on the idea that you might actually deserve happiness. I don't deserve... Stop. Just stop. Her eyes blazed suddenly. Fierce, angry. You're the Alpha King, the man who unified kingdoms, who built an empire, who made decisions that shaped thousands of lives. And you're standing here telling me you don't deserve to choose your own life. That's not how it works. That's exactly how it works. That's the choice you're making. Harriet moved closer, close enough that he could smell the familiar scent of her, lavender and earth and freedom. You're choosing a version of kingship that requires you to be something other than human, and you're calling it duty. What would you have me do? Break the treaty, humiliate Marana, destroy the alliance, start a potential war because I fell in love with the wrong woman at the wrong time? I would have you ask yourself if this kingdom is actually worth the cost. If the empire you're building is something that can survive without you turning yourself into stone. The words landed like hammer blows, each one finding weaknesses in armor Torsten hadn't known existed. I have to go, Harriet said. Her voice was thick. The delegation leaves tomorrow. We got what we came for. You're leaving tomorrow. I can't stay. Can't watch this. Can't... Her voice broke slightly. I thought I could come here and be professional and keep my distance, but I can't watch you choose that crown over yourself one more time. Harriet, I love you. The words came out fierce, final. I walked away because I love you too much to watch you destroy yourself for an empire that will forget you the moment you're gone. But you haven't learned that yet. Haven't figured out that all this, she gestured at the throne room, the crown, the weight of it all, means nothing if you're empty inside. She turned and walked toward the door. Torsten's voice stopped her one last time. If I chose differently, if I broke the treaty, would you stay? Harriet looked back, tears on her cheeks, open, vulnerable, everything he'd never allowed himself to be. I would build a life with you that actually mattered, not crowns, not empires, just us, choosing each other every day instead of choosing duty. The door closed, and Torsten stood alone in the council chamber with the crown pressing down and the slow-growing understanding that he was about to lose the only thing that had ever made him feel human. 3 weeks until the wedding. 3 weeks to decide if he was going to be the king everyone expected, or the man he'd never allowed himself to become. The choice should have been obvious: duty over desire, responsibility over personal happiness. That's what being the Alpha King required. But standing in that empty chamber, Torsten finally understood what Harriet had been trying to tell him all along. A kingdom built on one man's strength was just a monument to isolation. And the crown he'd sacrificed everything to wear was just a weight that would crush him unless he found something worth carrying it for. The question now, the only question that mattered, was whether he still had time to choose differently, or whether he'd already committed himself to a future where power was all he had left. The northern delegation left at dawn. Torsten didn't watch them go. Couldn't. The thought of seeing Harriet ride away a second time felt like inviting a blade into his chest and holding it there until the pain became permanent. Instead, he stood in the war room and stared at maps that showed an empire he no longer recognized. 3 weeks. 21 days until he married a woman he respected but didn't love. 21 days to figure out if duty was worth the slow death of everything human inside him. The door opened without warning. Garrick entered. His face was carved stone, the expression he wore when delivering news that would hurt but couldn't be avoided. "We have a problem," the old warrior said. Torsten didn't look up from the maps. "We have several problems. You're going to need to be more specific." King Vorenus requested a private audience. This morning, before the northern delegation left. That's not unusual. Treaty negotiations require... He asked about Harriet. The words landed like a fist to the gut. Torsten's head snapped up. What did you tell him? The truth. That she was a representative from the northern valleys, that she came to petition the council, that the king granted her audience because he'd given his word. And what did Vorenus say? Nothing. Garrick's jaw worked. That's what worries me. Man's too calculating to show his hand, but he was asking questions about how long you'd known her, whether there was history, whether your commitment to the wedding was absolute. This is what happens when you show weakness, Torsten thought, when you admit uncertainty, when you let emotion crack the facade of absolute control. Predators smell blood in the water and start circling. I'll speak with him, Torsten said, clarify the situation. And say what? That the woman you're clearly in love with just happened to show up 3 weeks before your wedding, and it means nothing. It has to mean nothing, because the alternative destroys the alliance, destroys everything I've built. Garrick was quiet for a long moment. Then, maybe you built the wrong thing. The old warrior left before Torsten could respond, leaving him alone with maps and the slow-growing dread that everything was about to collapse in ways he couldn't control. King Vorenus was waiting in the solar. The smaller receiving room overlooked the eastern gardens. Sunlight streamed through tall windows. Everything bright and warm and completely at odds with the tension in the air. Vorenus stood with his back to the door, hands clasped behind him. The posture of a man who'd learned to read rooms and people with surgical precision. He didn't turn when Torsten entered. Your Majesty, Vorenus said. His voice was pleasant, conversational. Thank you for making time. Of course. What can I do for you? You can tell me the truth. The words hung in the air, carefully neutral, carrying weight that had nothing to do with volume. Torsten closed the door, moved to the window, positioned himself so he could see Vorenus's face. I'm not sure what you're asking. The woman from the north, the one who led the delegation. Vorenus finally turned. His eyes were flat, calculating. Your guards say you met with her privately, after the council session, that you spoke for nearly an hour. We were discussing the northern situation, the implementation of... Don't. Vorenus's pleasant mask cracked slightly. Don't insult my intelligence. I built a throne on understanding when men are lying to me. And you're lying. Torsten's hands curled into fists at his sides. Careful, Vorenus. You're in my keep. Speaking to me about honesty. Make sure you remember the difference between allies and enemies. That's exactly what I'm trying to determine. Whether we're actually allies, or whether I'm about to bind my daughter to a man who's already committed elsewhere. There is no commitment. Harriet Dunvale is a representative. Nothing more. Harriet. Vorenus smiled. Thin, sharp. You use her first name. Interesting. Because I know her. She lived in the capital for a time, before she returned north. And that's all. Yes. The lie tasted like ash, because it wasn't all. Had never been all. Harriet was the woman who'd made him question everything, who'd walked away because he'd offered her a crown instead of a choice, who'd just left again because watching him choose duty over himself was too painful to endure. But admitting that to Vorenus would destroy the alliance, would humiliate Marana, would make Torsten look weak and indecisive and exactly the kind of king other rulers ate alive. Vorenus studied him, long, searching. Then he nodded slowly. Very well. I'll take you at your word. The younger king moved toward the door, paused with his hand on the frame. But understand something, Torsten. I didn't climb to a throne by trusting people. I verify. I watch. And if I discover you've lied to me, if I find out this wedding is anything other than your absolute commitment, the consequences will be severe. Is that a threat? It's a promise. Because I'm not just offering you my daughter, I'm offering legitimacy, stability, the kind of foundation that keeps kingdoms standing. And if you damage that, if you make a fool of my family, I will burn everything you've built to the ground. The words were delivered calmly, pleasantly, with the same conversational tone he'd used to discuss the weather, which made them infinitely more dangerous. Noted, Torsten said quietly. Vorenus left. The door closed with a soft click, and Torsten stood in the solar with sunlight streaming through windows and the slow-growing understanding that he'd just been put on notice by a man who'd killed his way to power and had no qualms about doing it again. This is the thing about building empires on fear, he thought. about ruling through dominance and the absolute certainty that strength was all that mattered. It worked right up until the moment someone stronger or more ruthless decided to test you, and then everything you'd built became a weapon that could be used against you. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of wedding preparations and political maneuvering. Vorenus was everywhere, observing, questioning. His people spread through the keep like a virus, talking to servants, guards, anyone who might have information about the king's personal life. Torsten felt the noose tightening. Every conversation felt like an interrogation. Every decision scrutinized. Every moment measured against the standard of absolute commitment to the alliance. And through it all, the wedding approached. 1 week remaining. 7 days until he stood before the court and bound himself to Princess Marana. 7 days to convince himself this was the right choice. He failed spectacularly. Lady Saren found him in the throne room late one evening. He'd dismissed the servants hours ago, sat alone in the dark with only moonlight filtering through high windows. "You look like a man attending his own execution," she observed. "Feels about right." She poured wine from the cabinet, brought 2 glasses, sat on the steps of the dais like they were equals instead of king and counselor. "I've served your family for 30 years, Saren said quietly. Watched your father build this kingdom. Watched it nearly tear itself apart when he died. Watched you rebuild it into something stronger. Where are you going with this? I'm saying I've seen what duty costs, what it takes from the people who carry it, and I'm asking if you've actually calculated the price you're about to pay. The price is irrelevant. The kingdom needs this alliance. Does it?" Saren sipped her wine. "Or have we convinced ourselves we need it because that's easier than admitting we might be wrong? We need Blackwater's navy. We need the political stability. We need a king who actually wants to rule, not a man going through the motions while dying inside." The words cut, clean, surgical. Finding the truth Torsten had been avoiding. "I made a commitment," he said. The words felt hollow. "I signed the treaty. I gave my word. You also gave your word to the northern valleys. Promised them representation. Promised to listen. Promised to build something different than what came before." Saren's eyes were sharp in the moonlight. "You can't keep both promises. Can't build a kingdom on new principles while binding yourself to old patterns." "What are you suggesting?" "I'm not suggesting anything. I'm stating facts. The wedding is in 7 days. You have 7 days to decide if the crown is worth losing yourself completely." "I've already lost." "No, not yet. But you will." Saren stood, set her glass down with deliberate care. "The moment you marry that girl while in love with someone else, the moment you choose political convenience over everything human, you'll become exactly what your father was. Powerful, respected, feared, and utterly alone." She left, and Torsten sat in darkness with the crown pressing down and wondered when exactly he'd stopped being a man and started being a monument to duty. The explosion came 3 days before the wedding, literally, a bomb in the Eastern Market. Crude, poorly constructed, but effective enough. 7 dead, 20 injured, chaos spreading through the city like wildfire. Torsten was in the war room within minutes. Garrick already there. Maps spread, reports coming in from city guards. "Who's claiming responsibility?" Torsten demanded. "No one yet." "But—" Garrick hesitated. The guard found something near the blast site. "What?" The old warrior slid a piece of fabric across the table, torn, stained with blood and soot, but recognizable. Northern weave, the distinctive pattern used by Highland communities. Torsten's blood went cold. "That doesn't mean—" "There's more." Garrick's voice was grim. 3 witnesses claimed they saw a group leaving the market just before the explosion. Said they looked northern, spoke with Highland accents. "No." Torsten's hands flattened on the table. "This is wrong. The northern delegation left weeks ago. They're not... Someone wants us to think they're involved. Or someone from the north decided peaceful negotiation wasn't working fast enough. That's not how Harriet operates. Not how Kale... You don't know how they operate? Not really. You gave them 3 months. Gave them hope. And maybe someone up north decided hope wasn't enough." The door burst open. King Vorenus strode in. His face was carved stone. fury barely contained beneath diplomatic veneer. 7 of my people were in that market, he said. His voice was deadly quiet. 3 of them are dead, including one of my daughter's attendants. I'm sorry for your loss. We're investigating. You're investigating. Varenis's control cracked. An attack happens 3 days before the wedding. Northern fabrics found at the scene. And you're investigating. We don't know who's responsible. I know who's responsible. The people you gave concessions to. The rebels you negotiated with instead of crushing. The woman you met with privately while claiming she meant nothing. The accusation hung in the air. Poisonous, damaging. Exactly the kind of thing that destroyed alliances. That's not... Torsten started. Prove it. Varenis leaned across the table. Send your army north. Root out whoever planned this. Show me your commitment to this alliance is absolute. You're asking me to invade the northern valleys based on circumstantial evidence. I'm asking you to protect your kingdom, to show that terror attacks have consequences, to prove that your word actually means something. My word is binding, but I won't slaughter communities based on suspicion. Then you're weak. Varenis straightened. And I won't bind my daughter to a weak king. The threat was explicit now, clear, unavoidable. Choose the north or choose the alliance. Choose Harriet or choose the crown. Torsten's jaw clenched. You're making a mistake, jumping to conclusions before we have facts. The only mistake I made was believing you'd actually changed, that maybe the great Alpha King had learned something from his northern distraction. Varenis moved toward the door. You have 24 hours. Send troops north or the wedding is canceled. The treaty void. And you can explain to your council why you destroyed the most important alliance this kingdom has seen in generations. He left. The door slammed. Garrick was the first to speak. He's bluffing. Has to be. Canceling the wedding would humiliate his daughter, make him look unstable, or it makes him look principled. Torsten's voice was hollow, like a king who refuses to ally with someone who won't protect their own people. The silence stretched, both men understanding the impossible position they were in. We need to investigate, Garrick said finally. Find out who actually planted that bomb. Because I don't believe for 1 second Harriet or Kael were involved. Neither do I. But belief isn't evidence. Then get evidence. You have resources, informants. Use them. In 24 hours, work faster. Torsten wanted to argue, wanted to explain that investigations took time, that rushing led to mistakes, that innocent people got hurt when you moved too fast. But Varenis had given him a deadline, and the crown didn't allow for the luxury of caution. Send riders north, Torsten said. His throat felt tight. I need to speak with Harriet and Kael. Need to know if they have any information about radical elements in the valleys. And if they don't, then we're out of options. Met. The riders returned 16 hours later, covered in road dust, exhausted, bearing news that made Torsten's blood run cold. The northern valleys were mobilizing, not for attack, for defense. Word had spread about the bombing, about the northern fabric found at the scene, about accusations of northern involvement, and the communities were preparing for retaliation. Barricades going up, militias forming, the kind of defensive posture that came from people who'd learned not to trust central authority. Harriet sent a message. Short, direct, written in her precise hand. We had nothing to do with the attack. I give you my word. But if you send troops north based on lies, we will defend ourselves. Don't force us to choose between survival and trust. The words hit like a fist. Because she was right. Everything she'd said about him ruling through fear instead of building actual loyalty was coming true. Someone had bombed the market. Someone had planted northern fabric deliberately. And now the kingdom was tearing itself apart along exactly the fault lines he'd promised to heal. Garrick spread intelligence reports across the table. Our informants found something. One of the witnesses who claimed to see northerners leaving the market works for a merchant house with ties to Blackwater. Torsten's head snapped up. What? Gets better. The fabric found at the scene? Too clean, too deliberately placed, like someone wanted us to find it. You're saying this was staged. I'm saying someone benefits from the kingdom and Blackwater going to war with the northern valleys. Someone who wants to force your hand, make you choose between the alliance and the north. Who would? The question died in his throat, because he already knew the answer. Varenis. The man who'd built a throne on betrayal and assassination. Who'd warned Torsten that he verified everything. Who'd been watching, waiting, looking for leverage. This is what happens when you build empires on fear, Torsten realized. When you create systems where trust is weakness and loyalty is bought through threats. Eventually someone figures out how to weaponize that fear against you. We can't prove it, Garrick said quietly. Can't prove Varenus staged the attack. Even if we could, accusing him without absolute evidence would start a war. Torsten finished. Either way, we're trapped. The door opened. Lady Saren entered. Her face was pale, drawn, the expression of someone delivering news they wish they didn't have to share. The council has convened, she said. Emergency session. They're demanding action. What kind of action? Lord Brennick is calling for military deployment to the northern valleys. Immediate, overwhelming. Make an example before the violence spreads. Based on what evidence? Based on fear. Based on the understanding that if you don't act decisively, if you show any hesitation, the entire kingdom will see weakness. Saren's voice was flat. Varenus has been talking to the council, suggesting that your judgment is compromised, that your northern connections make you unable to rule effectively. He's staging a coup, Garrick growled, political assassination, making you choose between looking weak or committing atrocities against innocent people, and either choice destroys me. Torsten stood, moved to the window, looked out over the city he'd spent 20 years protecting. If I send troops north, I become the tyrant Harriet accused me of being. Prove that everything she said about ruling through fear was right. Destroy any chance of actually building something better. And if you don't, Saren said quietly, the council will question your fitness to rule. Varenus will cancel the wedding. The alliance collapses. And you'll be seen as a king who let terror attacks go unpunished because of personal attachment. The trap was perfect, absolute, inescapable. Varenus had engineered a situation where every option led to Torsten's destruction. Send troops north, lose Harriet, lose any moral authority, become the thing he'd sworn not to be. Refuse, lose the alliance, lose the council's support, lose the crown itself. This is what it means to rule, Torsten thought, to stand at the intersection of impossible choices and understand that hesitation gets people killed. His father had hesitated during peace negotiations, had died with a knife in his back. Torsten had sworn never to make the same mistake, had built an empire on certainty, on decisive action, on the understanding that kings didn't have the luxury of doubt. But standing at the window with the crown pressing down and the weight of impossible choices crushing him, Torsten realized something that felt like falling. His father's mistake hadn't been hesitation. It had been isolation. Building a kingdom so focused on control that everyone around him became either a tool or a threat. No allies, no trust, no foundation that could survive him. And Torsten had spent 20 years repeating the same pattern. The council is waiting, Saren said gently. You need to make a decision. Tell them I'll address them within the hour. Saren hesitated. What are you planning? Something my father would never have done. Which is the truth. Nets. The council chamber was packed. Every lord, every lady, every person with even marginal political influence had turned out to witness the king's response to the crisis. Varenus sat in the front row, his expression carefully neutral, but his eyes were sharp, hungry, watching for any sign of weakness. Princess Marana sat beside him. Her face was pale. She'd lost friends in the bombing, had every right to demand vengeance, but she just looked tired and sad, like someone who understood that politics had turned tragedy into leverage. Torsten entered through the main doors. No ceremony, no announcement, just walked to the front of the chamber and stood before the assembled power of his kingdom. The crown felt impossibly heavy. He removed it, set it on the table in front of him. The room went absolutely silent, because kings didn't remove their crowns, didn't set aside the symbol of their authority. Not in public, not ever. 3 days ago, Torsten said. His voice was steady, clear. 7 people died in the Eastern Market. 20 more were injured. It was a tragedy, an atrocity, and it demands response. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the chamber. Evidence was found suggesting northern involvement, fabric, witnesses, the kind of circumstantial proof that in any other situation would demand immediate retaliation. Lord Brennick leaned forward, his jowls quivering with barely contained eagerness. But I've also received intelligence suggesting the evidence was planted, that the witnesses have ties to foreign interests, that this attack was designed not to harm us, but to manipulate us into destroying ourselves. The murmurs turned into outright conversation. Varenus's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind his eyes. So I'm faced with a choice, Torsten continued. Send troops north based on questionable evidence and potentially slaughter innocent communities, or refuse and be seen as weak, compromised, unfit to rule. Both choices serve someone's agenda. Both lead to outcomes that benefit everyone except the people I'm supposed to protect. Lord Brennick stood. His voice boomed through the chamber. Your Majesty, with respect, we cannot allow terror attacks to go. Sit down, Brennick. The words came out flat. Final. The Lord sat. I've spent 20 years building this kingdom on strength, Torsten said. On certainty. On the understanding that hesitation was weakness and control was everything. I built it the same way my father did, the same way his father did. Generation after generation of kings who believed power was the point. And it worked. We have stability, order, an empire that endures. But at what cost? Torsten looked at the crown sitting on the table. That piece of metal has defined every decision I've made for 2 decades. I've sacrificed relationships, abandoned personal desires, turned myself into something that looks like a king but has forgotten how to be human. And now someone is using that against me. Using my commitment to duty, my fear of appearing weak, my absolute certainty that control is the only thing that matters. They're weaponizing the very foundation I built this kingdom on. The chamber was absolutely still, every person hanging on his words, because the Alpha King was admitting vulnerability, admitting uncertainty, doing everything kings weren't supposed to do. So I'm making a different choice, Torsten said. I'm choosing to trust, to believe that the people of the Northern Valleys, people I gave my word to, people I promised representation, didn't commit this atrocity. I'm choosing to believe that Princess Mirana and King Vorenus want genuine alliance built on mutual respect, not leverage extracted through manufactured crisis. His eyes found Varenus. The younger king's face had gone carefully blank, and I'm choosing to believe that this council, these lords and ladies who've served this kingdom for generations, want actual security more than they want the appearance of strength. But here's the thing about trust. It requires risk, requires the possibility of being wrong, requires admitting that I don't have all the answers. So I'm asking, not commanding, asking, give me 3 days. Let me investigate without deploying troops. Let me find the truth instead of reacting to manipulation. And if I'm wrong, if the evidence proves Northern involvement, I will personally lead the army north. We'll do whatever is necessary to protect this kingdom. But if I'm right, if this is exactly the kind of manufactured crisis it appears to be, then we need to ask ourselves what kind of kingdom we actually want to build. One based on fear and control, or one based on something that might actually last beyond our lifetimes. The silence stretched, long, tense, unbearable. Then Princess Mirana stood. Every eye turned to her. She moved to the front of the chamber, stood beside Torsten. Her voice was soft, but carried through the absolute quiet. I lost friends in that bombing, people I cared about, and my first instinct was rage. Demand vengeance, make someone pay. But standing here listening to King Torsten, I'm reminded of something my mother told me before she died. She paused, drew a breath. She said that anyone can rule through fear. That takes no skill, no courage. But building something people actually believe in? Something they'll defend because they want to, not because they're afraid not to? That takes everything. Mirana looked at her father. And I think she was right. Varenus's expression cracked, just slightly, enough to show the fury beneath. The princess turned back to the council. I support King Torsten's request. 3 days. Let him investigate. If we're going to bind our kingdoms together, let it be through trust, not threats. She sat down. The chamber erupted, voices overlapping, arguments, agreements, chaos. Lord Brennick was shouting about weakness, about setting precedents, about the absolute necessity of swift action. But Lady Saren was nodding slowly, and several other council members looked thoughtful rather than outraged. The vote was close, closer than it should have been, But ultimately, the council agreed. 3 days, 72 hours to find the truth. The chamber adjourned in chaos, lords and ladies filing out with expressions ranging from respect to disgust to calculation. Vorenus approached as the room emptied. His face was stone, eyes flat with barely contained rage. "You think you're clever," he said quietly. "Think you've outmaneuvered me. I think I'm trying to find the truth." "There is no truth. Only power, and the people strong enough to wield it." Vorenus leaned closer. "You just showed this entire court that you're willing to trust over certainty, to ask instead of command. You made yourself vulnerable. I made myself human. Same thing." The younger king stepped back. 3 days. "But understand this, Torsten. If you don't find evidence clearing the north, if this investigation comes up empty, I will make sure everyone knows you sacrificed security for sentiment. And the crown you just set down, you'll never be able to pick it back up." He left, taking his daughter with him. Marana looked back once. Her expression was complex. Might have been approval, might have been pity. Then she was gone, leaving Torsten alone in the council chamber with the crown sitting on the table and the slow-growing understanding that he'd just bet everything on a truth he couldn't prove. Garrick appeared in the doorway. The old warrior's face was grim. That was either the bravest thing you've ever done or the most suicidal. I honestly can't tell which. Neither can I. You have 3 days to prove Vorenus staged the bombing, 3 days to find evidence that will convince the council. And if I fail, I lose everything. The alliance, the council's support, probably the crown itself. And you're okay with that?" "No." Torsten picked up the crown, felt the familiar weight. "But I'm done building kingdoms on fear, done making decisions that preserve power while destroying everything human. If I lose the crown because I chose to trust people instead of controlling them, then maybe I never deserved it in the first place." Garrick was quiet for a long moment. "Your father would have handled this differently. He would have sent troops north, would have crushed the perceived threat, would have maintained absolute control right up until someone put a knife in his back, and you think your way is better. It's the only way that doesn't turn me into him." The old warrior nodded slowly. "Then let's get to work. 3 days isn't much time to unravel a conspiracy. Where do we start?" "With the people who benefit most from the kingdom tearing itself apart." Garrick's expression was grim. "And with the understanding that Vorenus isn't the only predator circling, we've been so focused on external threats, we haven't been watching what's happening inside our own walls." The words landed with cold certainty, because Garrick was right. Vorenus might have staged the bombing, but he'd needed help. Needed people inside the capital, people with access, people who benefited from chaos, people who'd been part of Torsten's court all along. The investigation began that night. Garrick deployed informants, questioned guards, followed money trails and whispered conversations through corridors that suddenly felt full of enemies. And Torsten sat in the war room with the crown beside him and tried to understand how everything he'd built had become a weapon pointed at his own heart. 3 days. 72 hours to find the truth. 72 hours to prove that trust was stronger than fear. Or 72 hours until everything collapsed, and the kingdom learned what happened when the Alpha King chose humanity over dominance. The answer would determine everything. And somewhere in the northern valleys, Harriet was preparing her people for war, not because she wanted to, but because she'd learned the hard way that survival meant being ready when the people who promised to protect you decided control was more important than keeping their word. The irony wasn't lost on Torsten. He'd spent 20 years trying to be different than his father, and he'd built the exact same trap. The only question now was whether he could dismantle it before it crushed everything he'd ever cared about, including himself. The first piece of evidence arrived at midnight. A messenger stumbled into the war room, covered in road dust, exhausted, bearing a sealed letter from one of Garrick's most trusted informants embedded in the Blackwater delegation. Torsten broke the seal with hands that were steadier than they had any right to be, read the contents once, twice, a third time because the implications were too massive to trust on a single reading. Then he looked at Garrick. The old warrior's face was carved stone in the torchlight, his eyes flat with the kind of cold fury that came from decades of watching men betray everything they claimed to value. "How certain are we?" Torsten asked quietly. "The informant is solid.
Been with me for 15 years, never given bad intelligence. Garrick's jaw worked. This is real.
The letter detailed everything: bank transfers, coded messages, a network of Blackwater agents who'd been operating in the capital for months, all orchestrated by King Vorenus himself. The bombing had been his from the beginning, staged to force Torsten's hand, to create the exact crisis that would either destroy the Northern Alliance or make the king look weak for hesitating. Perfect manipulation, surgical in its precision. And it had almost worked. "This isn't enough," Torsten said. The words tasted like ash. "It's a letter, testimony from an anonymous source. The council will demand proof, physical evidence, something they can see and touch and verify." Then we get it. Garrick crossed to the maps. The informant says there's a safe house, Eastern Quarter, where Vorenus's agents have been meeting. If we move fast, we might catch them before they scatter. How fast? The warrior's smile was predatory. Have I ever let you down? No. But we're running out of time. 2 days left, and if this goes wrong, if they're warned, then we're finished. I know. Garrick was already moving toward the door, strapping on weapons with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd done this 1,000 times. Which is why we don't fail. Wait. Torsten's voice stopped him. I'm coming with you. The old warrior turned, stared at him like he'd suggested flying to the moon. You're the king. You don't raid safe houses. You send people like me. Not this time. This is my fight, my kingdom, my responsibility. Torsten reached for his own weapons, started buckling them on with hands that remembered violence even after 20 years of politics. I'm done sitting on thrones while other people bleed for decisions I make. Your father would have... My father got himself killed because he never trusted anyone enough to fight beside them. Torsten met Garrick's eyes. I'm not making that mistake. For a long moment, neither man moved. Then Garrick nodded slowly. Like you said, your fight. They moved through the keep like shadows, taking corridors servants used, avoiding guards and courtiers and anyone who might ask questions. Outside, the night was cold, clear, stars bright enough to navigate by. 6 men waited in the courtyard, hand-picked, veterans Garrick had served with for decades. The kind of warriors who understood that some missions didn't officially exist. No one spoke as they moved through the capital streets. No need. These men had fought together so long they communicated in gestures and glances. The Eastern Quarter was rougher than the rest of the city. Narrow streets, buildings pressed close together, the kind of place where people minded their own business and strangers disappeared without questions. The safe house sat in a dead-end alley, 2 stories, shuttered windows, no light visible. But smoke rising from the chimney, someone was home. Garrick held up a hand. The squad stopped, melted into shadows like they'd been born there. The old warrior leaned close to Torsten, whispered, 2 guards at the back entrance, 1 on the roof. We go in hard, fast. Don't give them time to burn documents or send warnings. Prisoners, if possible. But evidence first. Can't prove conspiracy with dead men's testimony alone. Torsten nodded, drew his blade. The weight felt familiar. Right. Like coming home after a long absence. This is what people don't understand about leadership, he thought, about the burden of being the alpha. The one everyone else defers to because the alternative is chaos. It wasn't about sitting on thrones making pronouncements. It wasn't about crowns and ceremony and the performance of power. It was about this. Standing in a dark alley with violence coming and knowing that the decisions you made in the next few minutes would determine if people lived or died, if kingdoms stood or fell. And then making those decisions anyway, because hesitation got everyone killed. Garrick signaled. 3 fingers. 2. 1. They moved. The guards at the back entrance died quietly, professionally. Throats cut before they could raise an alarm, bodies lowered to the ground with practiced care. Inside, the building was sparse. Functional, no decoration, no comfort. Just the bare necessities for people who knew they might need to abandon everything at a moment's notice. Voices from the second floor, muffled. Conversation in a language that wasn't the common tongue of the Highlands. Blackwater dialect. Confirmation that the intelligence was solid. The squad split. 4 men securing the ground floor. Torsten and Garrick taking the stairs. Moving with the kind of lethal silence that came from decades of survival. The second floor opened into a single large room. Maps spread across a table. Documents. Ledgers showing money transfers. And three men in black watercolors going very still as they realized they weren't alone. One reached for a weapon. Garrick put a crossbow bolt through his shoulder. The man screamed, collapsed, hand clutching the wound. The other two raised their hands slowly, faces pale, understanding that resistance meant death. "Don't move," Torsten said quietly. His blade was steady, pointed at the nearest man's throat. "Don't speak. Don't even breathe heavy. You're going to answer questions, and if I think you're lying, you'll join your friend on the floor." The men nodded, terror clear in their eyes. Because this was the thing about being the Alpha King. The reputation built over 20 years of decisive action and zero tolerance for threats. These men had heard stories, knew what happened to people who crossed Torsten Ashgrove, and now they were face to face with the reality that crowns and throne rooms were just the civilized face of a man who'd built an empire through violence when necessary. Garrick moved to the table, started gathering documents. His expression shifted as he read, went from grim to something darker. "Torsten, you need to see this." "What?" The old warrior held up a ledger. "This isn't just about the bombing. Vorenus has been planning this for months, bribing council members, planting agents throughout the keep." He gestured at the maps. "He's been positioning naval forces, preparing for an invasion." An invasion. Of what? Of here. Of the Highlands. The treaty was never about alliance. It was reconnaissance. Get inside your defenses, marry his daughter into the throne, and then stage a coup once he had enough leverage. The words landed like blows, each one finding gaps in Torsten's understanding of just how badly he'd been manipulated. Vorenus had never wanted partnership, had wanted conquest, and he'd almost gotten it. Would have gotten it if Torsten had sent troops north, if the kingdom had torn itself apart over manufactured evidence while Blackwater forces moved into position. The wedding was supposed to be the trigger. Marana married to the king. Vorenus's people embedded throughout the keep, and then some convenient accident, some tragic assassination that put Vorenus's daughter on the throne with her father as regent. Perfect. Bloodless. A coup disguised as succession. "How long?" Torsten asked. His voice was hollow. "How long have they been planning this?" The ledger goes back 8 months, before he even proposed the treaty. Garrick's face was stone. This was always the plan. The alliance was theater. The bombing was just acceleration when things weren't moving fast enough. One of the prisoners made a sound. Might have been agreement. Might have been fear. Torsten crossed to him, crouched down so they were eye level. His blade rested casually against the man's throat. "Talk. Everything you know. And maybe you live to see morning." The man talked, spilled everything in a rush of terrified confession, confirmed the invasion plan, named names of council members who'd been bought, detailed the timeline for the coup, and revealed the final piece that made Torsten's blood run cold. Vorenus had a contingency. If the investigation proved his involvement, if Torsten found evidence of the conspiracy, he was going to claim the king had manufactured it, that Torsten was so obsessed with the northern woman that he'd invented a conspiracy to avoid the wedding, that the great Alpha King had become unfit to rule, and the council members Vorenus had bought would support that narrative, would call for abdication, would tear the kingdom apart in civil war. Either way, Vorenus won. Either Torsten looked like a tyrant who'd destroyed the northern valleys, or a lovesick fool who'd invented conspiracies, or a king who'd been outmaneuvered so completely his own council demanded his removal. Perfect manipulation. No matter which choice Torsten made, Vorenus benefited. The realization should have felt like defeat, like standing at the edge of an abyss with no way forward. Instead, it felt like clarity, because Torsten finally understood what Harriet had been trying to tell him all along, what Garrick had been saying, what even Princess Marana had hinted at. Power built on control was just a cage. The more you tried to maintain it, the more ways people found to weaponize it against you. But power built on trust, on actual loyalty, on people choosing to stand with you instead of being forced to kneel. That was something that couldn't be bought, couldn't be manipulated, couldn't be destroyed by clever men with invasion plans and bribed council members. "Secure the prisoners," Torsten said. His voice was steady, calm, the kind of certainty that came from finally understanding what needed to be done. Get these documents to Lady Saren. Tell her to verify everything. Cross-reference with Treasury records. Find every council member Vorenus bought. And you, Garrick asked, where will you be? Ending this. Torsten found Vorenus in the guest wing. Late night, most of the keep asleep. The younger king sat at a desk, reading correspondence by candlelight. He looked up as Torsten entered. No surprise on his face, just calculation. Your Majesty, no guards, no ceremony. This must be important. Torsten closed the door, locked it. The sound of the bolt sliding home was loud in the sudden quiet. We found your safe house, your agents, your invasion plans, all of it. Vorenus's expression didn't change, didn't even flicker. Just set down his pen with careful precision. Interesting. And what do you plan to do with this information? Expose you, show the council exactly what you've been planning, dismantle everything you've built. Will you? The younger king stood, moved to the window, hands clasped behind his back. Because I think you'll find that's more complicated than it appears. You bought council members, bribed them, but you didn't buy everyone. Saren's clean, half the northern lords, enough to prove your conspiracy. Perhaps, but proof is such a flexible concept. Vorenus turned from the window. Who will they believe, Torsten? A king with documented history of negotiating with rebels, of showing weakness, of being romantically entangled with a northern woman. Or me. A fellow king warning them about a ruler whose judgment has been compromised. You staged a bombing, killed innocent people. Did I? Or did I simply take advantage of an attack that was going to happen anyway? Vorenus's smile was cold. You see the beauty of it. I don't even need to convince them I'm innocent. I just need to create enough doubt about your fitness to rule. This is what happens when you build kingdoms on manipulation, Torsten realized. When you treat people as chess pieces instead of human beings, eventually you meet someone who's better at the game, someone more ruthless, someone who's willing to sacrifice anything to win, and then all your careful planning becomes a weapon they use to destroy you. You made a mistake, Torsten said quietly. Only one. You assumed I cared more about the crown than I care about doing what's right. Vorenus laughed. It was genuine amusement. That's not a mistake. That's a certainty. You're the Alpha King. Power is all you have, all you've ever had. You think you're going to throw it away for principle. Watch me. The younger king's smile faltered, just slightly. What are you talking about? Tomorrow morning I'm calling an emergency council session. I'm going to present all the evidence, show them exactly what you've been planning, and then I'm going to give them a choice. What choice? Between two versions of the kingdom. One built on fear and control, where kings manipulate and threaten and treat their people like tools. Or one built on trust and accountability, where even the Alpha King can be questioned and challenged and held responsible for his actions. You're insane. Vorenus's voice hardened. You do that, and you destroy yourself. The council members I bought will claim the evidence is manufactured. Will say you're unfit to rule. It'll tear the kingdom apart. Maybe. Or maybe they'll surprise us both. Maybe they're tired of being treated like pawns. Maybe they want to build something that doesn't require constant fear to maintain. And if you're wrong, if they choose my version, what then? Then I lose. Simple as that. I abdicate. Step down. Let someone else carry the crown. Torsten moved toward the door, unlocked it. But at least I'll lose as a man instead of winning as a monster. You're a fool, probably. But I'm done playing games with people who mistake cruelty for strength. Torsten left, walked through corridors that suddenly felt less like a trap and more like a place he might actually want to fight for. Behind him, Vorenus stood alone in the guest chamber, face twisted with fury and something that might have been fear, because he'd built his entire strategy on one assumption, that Torsten Ashgrove valued power above everything else, that the Alpha King could be manipulated through threats to his authority, and that assumption had just collapsed. Leaving Vorenus with invasion plans he couldn't execute, bought council members who were about to be exposed, and a conspiracy that was about to explode in his face. The younger king crossed to his desk, pulled out parchment, started writing urgent messages, because if Torsten was actually insane enough to go through with this, if he actually presented evidence to the council and forced them to choose. Then Vorenus needed contingencies, needed leverage, needed something that would prevent complete disaster, and he had exactly one option left. Princess Marana. Dawn broke cold and clear. The council chamber filled early, lords and ladies arriving with expressions ranging from curiosity to concern. Word had spread that the king was calling an emergency session, that something significant was about to happen. The northern delegation was there, Kael and his people standing against the back wall. They'd returned overnight, riding hard when word reached them about the emergency session. And Harriet was with them. Torsten saw her the moment he entered, couldn't help it. His eyes found hers across the crowded chamber like magnetism, like gravity pulling celestial bodies into orbit. She looked exhausted, worried, but she met his gaze steadily. No accusation, no judgment, just presence, waiting to see what he would do. Vorenus sat in the front row with Marana beside him. The younger king's face was stone, giving away nothing, but his daughter looked pale, drawn, like someone who'd spent the night crying and trying to understand how her life had become leverage in a game she never wanted to play. The council settled, conversations dying, every eye turning to the front of the chamber where Torsten stood. No crown this time. He'd left it in his chambers, deliberately, because what he was about to do had nothing to do with the authority of office and everything to do with the courage to tell the truth. 3 days ago, Torsten began, his voice carried through the absolute quiet. 7 people died in the Eastern Market. Evidence suggested northern involvement. King Vorenus demanded immediate military response. I asked for time to investigate. You've all been wondering what I found. The chamber was absolutely still. Not a sound, not a breath, just hundreds of people waiting. Torsten gestured to Garrick. The old warrior stepped forward, began distributing documents, ledgers, maps, correspondence, all the evidence they'd gathered from the safe house. King Vorenus staged the bombing. The words fell into the silence like stones into still water. He planted evidence, bribed witnesses, created a crisis designed to force me into destroying the Northern Alliance or appearing weak. The chamber erupted, voices rising, shock, outrage, denial. Vorenus stood, his voice cut through the chaos. This is absurd, a desperate fabrication from a king whose judgment has been compromised, from a man more concerned with his northern mistress than the security of his kingdom. The accusation hung in the air, poisonous, designed to redirect, to make this about Torsten's relationship with Harriet instead of about the conspiracy. And it almost worked. Several council members shifted, whispered among themselves, looking between Torsten and Harriet with expressions that suggested Vorenus might have a point. This is what manipulation looks like, Torsten thought. This is how clever men destroy you, not through direct confrontation, but through suggestion, through making everyone question your motives until truth becomes irrelevant. You're right, Torsten said quietly. The chamber went silent. Vorenus blinked. What? You're right that my judgment has been affected, that my relationship with Harriet Dunvale has influenced my decisions, that I've been struggling to reconcile personal desire with duty to the crown. Murmurs rippled through the assembly. Because the Alpha King didn't admit weakness, didn't confess doubt, didn't hand enemies weapons to use against him. But I'm also right that you staged the bombing, that you've been planning an invasion, that you bought council members and planted agents and orchestrated everything to either destroy this kingdom or conquer it. Both things can be true. I can be compromised and you can be a liar. They're not mutually exclusive. Torsten moved to the center of the chamber, addressed the full council. For 20 years I've ruled this kingdom the way my father did, through strength, through certainty, through the absolute conviction that control was the only thing preventing chaos. And it worked. We have stability, order, an empire that endures. But at what cost? I've turned people into tools, relationships into transactions, trust into something that can be bought and sold and weaponized. And King Vorenus understood that, saw it, used it against me with surgical precision. So here's what I'm offering. The evidence is here. The ledgers, the documents, the testimony from his agents. Verify it. Cross-reference it. Take as long as you need, and while you're doing that, ask yourselves what kind of kingdom you actually want. One where kings rule through fear and manipulation, where power is the only thing that matters, where we sacrifice everything human in pursuit of control, or one where even the alpha king can admit he was wrong, can be challenged, can choose truth over convenience and trust over certainty. The chamber was absolutely silent, every person processing what they'd just heard, the implications, the choice Torsten was forcing them to make. Lady Saren stood. Her voice was steady, clear. I've reviewed the evidence. The ledgers are genuine. The bank transfers verified. King Vorenus has indeed been bribing council members. The conspiracy is real. Several lords erupted in protest. Denial, claiming the evidence was manufactured, but others were nodding slowly, looking at the documents Garrick had distributed, seeing the truth. Vorenus's face had gone pale, then red, then something closer to purple. This is treason, he snarled. You're attempting to void a legitimate treaty based on lies. My daughter and I came here in good faith, and your daughter came here because you needed legitimacy, Torsten interrupted, because you built a throne on assassination and betrayal, and you knew it wouldn't last without something to anchor it, and you saw my kingdom as that anchor, saw the alliance as a way to gain credibility while positioning forces for invasion. I have nothing but respect for Princess Marana. She's been honest, gracious, everything a queen should be. But you're a predator who mistakes cruelty for strength. The words echoed through the chamber. Final, damning, the kind of accusation that started wars or ended them depending on who blinked first. Vorenus moved before anyone could react, grabbed his daughter, pulled her in front of him like a shield. A blade appeared in his hand, pressed against her throat. The chamber exploded into chaos. Guards moving forward, council members scattering, voices screaming. But Torsten just stood there, absolutely still, eyes locked on Vorenus with the kind of cold fury that came from watching someone cross a line that could never be uncrossed. Let her go, he said quietly. Or what? You'll have your guards kill me. Risk hitting my daughter, your future queen. Vorenus's voice was manic, desperate. You think you've won, think you've outmaneuvered me. But I still have leverage. That's not leverage, that's desperation. And it proves everything I just said about you.
Marana's eyes were wide, terrified, but her voice was steady when she spoke. Father, please. You're only making this worse. Quiet. Vorenus's blade pressed harder, drew a thin line of blood. I'm getting out of here, getting back to Blackwater. And you're all going to let me, because if you don't, she dies. No one moved, the entire chamber frozen in the moment between violence and catastrophe. And Torsten understood with devastating clarity that this was the choice, the real one, not between duty and desire, not between the crown and Harriet, but between the man who maintained control through fear and the man who built something worth defending. His father would have negotiated, would have let Vorenus leave with his hostage rather than risk royal blood, would have chosen the path that preserved order even if it meant letting a monster escape. But Torsten wasn't his father. He moved. Fast. Faster than someone his size should be able to move. 20 years of politics hadn't dulled the warrior underneath. Crossed the space between them in 3 strides. Blade already drawn, already swinging. Vorenus saw him coming, started to shift, started to follow through on his threat. But Harriet was faster. She'd moved from the back wall the moment Vorenus grabbed Marana, had been closing distance while everyone else stood frozen. Her hand caught Vorenus's wrist, twisted, the kind of move that came from growing up in the Highlands where survival meant knowing how to fight. The blade fell. Marana dropped, scrambled away, and Torsten's momentum carried him forward. His shoulder hit Vorenus in the chest, drove him backward into the wall with force that cracked stone. The younger king collapsed, gasping, dazed. Guards swarmed, dragged him away, secured him with chains that said he wouldn't be going anywhere. The chamber erupted again, this time in stunned conversation, shock at what they'd just witnessed. Torsten crossed to Marana, helped her stand. His hands were gentle despite the adrenaline screaming through his system. Are you hurt? She touched her throat, came away with blood on her fingers, but shook her head. I'm all right. Her voice was shaky, thin. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry.
I didn't know he was planning any of this. I know. Torsten's voice was gentle. None of this is your fault. What happens now? Now you're free. Free to go home. Free to build your own life. Free to choose what you actually want instead of what your father decided. Tears spilled down her cheeks. She nodded, unable to speak. Harriet appeared at Torsten's shoulder, her presence steady, grounding. You all right? She asked quietly. No, but I will be. The council was watching, all of them, waiting to see what happened next, how this would resolve. Torsten turned to face them. Still no crown, still just a man who'd chosen truth over convenience. King Vorenus will be tried for conspiracy, for staging the bombing, for attempting to invade our kingdom. The evidence is clear. The verdict won't be in question. But the larger question remains. What kind of kingdom do we want to be? I can't answer that for you, can't command it or control it or demand compliance. All I can do is tell you what I choose. I choose trust over fear. Choose building something that actually earns loyalty instead of extracting it through threats. And if that's not what you want, if you'd rather have a king who rules the old way, through absolute control, through dominance, through the kind of power that requires no accountability, then find someone else, because I'm done pretending that crowns are more important than being human. The silence stretched, long, tense, unbearable. Then Lady Saren stood. I support the king, his approach, his choice. We've been ruling through fear for 3 generations. Maybe it's time to try something different. One by one, other council members rose. Not all of them, not even most at first. But enough. Enough to matter. Lord Brennick remained seated, his face red with fury. This is madness. Weakness. You're destroying everything we've built. No, Garrick said quietly. The old warrior stepped forward. We're building something that might actually last. Something worth defending instead of just maintaining. The vote was close. Closer than it should have been. But ultimately, the council agreed. New principles. New approach. A kingdom built on trust instead of fear. It would take time, would require constant work, would fail sometimes. But it was a start. The session adjourned, lords and ladies filing out with expressions ranging from hope to horror to calculation. The northern delegation remained. Cale approached, extended his hand. Well fought, Your Majesty. Torsten clasped it. Thank you. For coming back, for standing with me. We weren't standing with the crown. We were standing with the man who kept his word. There's a difference. The delegation left, filing out with quiet respect, leaving Torsten and Harriet alone in the chamber for the first time since she'd arrived. Neither spoke immediately. Too much to say. Too much that had happened. Too much that still needed to be resolved. Finally, Harriet broke the silence. You didn't have to do that. Risk everything. Give up control. Yes, I did. Because you were right. About all of it. About me ruling through fear instead of building something real. About the crown being a cage. About power meaning nothing if I destroyed myself to maintain it. So what now? Now I figure out how to actually be human again. How to rule without crushing everything good out of myself. Torsten's throat felt tight. And I ask if there's any chance you'd help me figure that out. Harriet's eyes were bright. Might have been tears. Might have been something else. As what? Your queen. As my partner. My equal. The person who challenges me when I'm wrong and stands beside me when I'm right. No crown unless you want one. No expectations except honesty. That's a big ask. I know. And if the answer is no, if I've damaged things too badly to repair, I'll understand. But I had to ask. Had to try. She was quiet for a long moment, studying him with that same direct gaze that had always made him feel seen. Then she smiled, small, tentative, but real. Ask me again in 6 months, after you've proven this isn't just crisis transformation, after you've actually built something worth believing in. I can do that. Good. Because I'm not settling for potential. I'm settling for proof. Fair. Harriet turned to leave, paused at the door, looked back. But Torsten, for what it's worth, what you did today, choosing truth over power, that was the bravest thing I've ever seen. She left, And Torsten stood alone in the council chamber with no crown and no certainty, and no guarantee that anything he was trying to build would actually work. But for the first time in 20 years, he felt like he was finally moving in the right direction. Finally building something that might actually matter. Not an empire, not a monument to control, but a kingdom where people chose to stay instead of being forced to kneel, where trust was the foundation instead of fear, where even the Alpha King could be challenged and questioned and held accountable. It would be hard, would require constant vigilance, would fail sometimes. But it was worth fighting for. Outside, dawn was fully broken, light streaming through windows, illuminating dust motes in the air. A new day, a new beginning. And somewhere in the keep, a crown sat abandoned on a desk, waiting to see if the man who'd worn it for 20 years could figure out how to carry it without being crushed by the weight. The answer remained to be seen, but Torsten was finally willing to find out. Boits. The message arrived 3 hours later, delivered by a nervous servant who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. Torsten broke the seal, read the contents, felt his blood run cold. It was from Blackwater, from Vorenus's commanders, the ones he'd positioned for invasion. They had Harriet, grabbed her the moment she left the keep, quiet, professional, no witnesses. And they were offering terms. Release King Vorenus, void the treason charges, let him return to Blackwater with full honors. Or they'd kill her, slowly, publicly. Make an example that would echo through generations. The message ended with coordinates, a location outside the city, where the exchange would take place at sunset. Come alone, or she dies. Torsten read it twice, 3 times, each word burning itself into his brain. Then he looked at Garrick. The old warrior had read over his shoulder. His face was carved stone. It's a trap, Garrick said quietly. Obviously. They're using her to draw you out, to kill you, and destabilize everything we just built. I know. And you're going anyway. Yes, that's suicide. Probably. But I'm done making decisions that sacrifice people I love for political convenience. Torsten stood, started gathering weapons. If I die, you become king. The council trusts you. The kingdom continues. And if you don't die, if you somehow survive and rescue her, what then? Then we build something worth living for instead of just dying to protect. The old warrior was quiet for a moment. Then he started gathering his own weapons. You said come alone. You didn't say anything about backup positioning at a distance. Garrick, I'm not asking permission. I'm telling you what's happening. You go in. I cover from range. We've done this before, 20 years ago. We're not as young as we were. Speak for yourself. I'm exactly as dangerous as I've always been. Despite everything, Torsten smiled. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. Thank me when we're both still breathing and she's safe. They prepared in silence. The practiced efficiency of men who'd fought together so long they didn't need words. And as the sun climbed toward its apex, Torsten understood that he was about to make the most dangerous choice of his life. Going into a trap, to save a woman who hadn't even agreed to stay with him, who'd asked for 6 months of proof before making any decisions. His father would have called it madness, would have sacrificed one person to save the kingdom, would have made the cold calculation that duty demanded. But Torsten finally understood something his father never had. A kingdom built on sacrificing the people you loved wasn't worth saving. And if he had to die proving that, if this was how it ended, at least he'd die as a man instead of a monument. The crown sat on the desk, abandoned, waiting. Torsten didn't pick it up, didn't need it where he was going. Where he was going, the only things that mattered were courage and the willingness to fight for something beyond power. Sunset was 6 hours away, 6 hours to prepare, to plan, to accept that he might not survive what came next. 6 hours until everything he'd built either proved itself worth the cost, or collapsed into the kind of tragedy that defined kingdoms for generations. The coordinates led to ruins, old fortifications from wars fought 3 generations ago, crumbling stone walls that had once protected something important and now stood as monuments to the impermanence of power. Torsten approached on foot, left his horse a mile back, weapons concealed beneath a traveling cloak that did nothing to hide what he was, the Alpha King, walking alone into a trap, choosing one life over the careful preservation of his own. His father would have been ashamed. The thought brought something that might have been a smile. Bitter, sharp, The kind of expression that came from finally understanding that shame from dead men meant nothing compared to living with choices that destroyed your soul. Garrick was positioned somewhere in the hills, too far to help in close combat, close enough to take shots if opportunities presented themselves. They'd gone over the plan 3 times. Simple, direct. No room for improvisation because improvisation got people killed. Torsten would negotiate, would offer himself in exchange for Harriet. And in the chaos of the exchange, Garrick would create openings. It was a terrible plan, had maybe a 20% chance of success, but it was all they had. The sun hung low on the horizon, painting the ruins in shades of gold and blood, light that made everything look softer than it was, more forgiving. A figure stepped from the shadows between broken walls, not Vorenus, one of his commanders, a man named Corvan who'd built a reputation on efficient brutality, the kind of soldier who followed orders without question and slept soundly afterward. Your Majesty. The commander's voice was flat. Professional. You came alone as instructed. Where is she? Corvain gestured. 3 more soldiers emerged from the ruins, Harriet between them, hands bound, cloth gag in her mouth. But her eyes were sharp, alert, already calculating, looking for weaknesses, for opportunities, for any chance to turn this situation from disaster into survival. She met Torsten's gaze across the distance, and something passed between them. Not words, not even conscious communication, just understanding that he'd come for her, that he'd chosen her over safety, over the crown, over everything he'd spent 20 years building, and that she would fight like hell to make sure that choice didn't kill them both. The terms are simple, Corvain said. You release King Vorenus, void all charges, provide safe passage back to Blackwater with full honors. In exchange, the woman lives, and if I refuse, then she dies, slowly, while you watch, and then you die. And Blackwater's navy blockades your ports until your kingdom starves. This is what happens when you build empires on violence, Torsten thought. When you establish that, might makes right. That power is the only currency that matters. Eventually, someone with a bigger army decides to take what you have, and all your careful planning becomes irrelevant in the face of superior force. His father had understood this, had tried to negotiate peace, had died for it, and Torsten had learned the wrong lesson, had decided that the problem was negotiation itself, that strength and certainty and absolute control were the answers. But standing in ruins built by men who'd believed the same thing, watching the woman he loved held hostage by soldiers who'd learned from the same brutal playbook, Torsten finally understood. Violence was easy, control was simple, fear was the most efficient tool for maintaining power. But they were also temporary, brittle, the kind of foundation that collapsed the moment someone stronger came along. What if I offered something different? Torsten said quietly. Corvain's expression didn't change. There's nothing different to offer. You have no leverage, no position to negotiate from. I have the truth about Vorenus, about his invasion plans, about the conspiracy he built over months, evidence that proves he's not a legitimate king but a usurper who murdered his way to a throne. That's not leverage. That's just words. Words that other kingdoms will hear. Other rulers who might be wondering if Vorenus can be trusted. If a man who stages bombings and plans invasions of his allies is someone they want to negotiate with. Corvain was quiet for a moment. Then he smiled. Cold, humorless. You think we care about legitimacy, about what other kingdoms think. We have the navy, we have the military, we take what we want and dare anyone to stop us. Then you've already lost. You just don't know it yet. The commander's smile faded. Explain. Kingdoms built on nothing but military strength last exactly as long as the military stays loyal. The moment your soldiers start questioning, the moment they wonder if they're serving something worth dying for or just one man's ambition, everything collapses. That's not how soldiers work. It's exactly how they work. I've been a soldier, led armies, watched men fight and bleed and die for causes they believed in. And the difference between an army that holds and one that breaks isn't equipment or training, it's belief, conviction that what they're protecting actually matters. Corvain's hand moved toward his weapon. This is pointless. You're stalling. I'm offering you a choice, same one I offered my own council, between 2 versions of the future, One where you follow orders and execute a woman for political leverage, where you become the kind of man who looks in mirrors and sees a monster, or one where you question if maybe, just maybe, the king you're serving isn't worth dying for. The commander's jaw clenched. You don't know anything about me. I know you're a soldier, know you followed orders your entire life. Know that's easier than thinking for yourself. But I also know that at some point, you chose this life, chose to serve, and that means somewhere inside you believe in something beyond just following commands. The question is what? Silence. Corvain staring at him with an expression that was impossible to read, calculating, measuring, trying to determine if this was manipulation or genuine offer. Behind him, the other soldiers shifted, uncertain, because they'd come here to execute orders, hadn't prepared for philosophy, for questions that made them examine choices they'd been avoiding. My king gave me a mission, Corvain said finally. His voice was carefully neutral. I complete missions. That's who I am. Then you're a tool, and tools don't get to choose, don't get to build, don't get to look back on their lives and feel anything other than empty. And you're better. The commander's voice hardened. The great Alpha King who just yesterday was ready to marry a woman he didn't love for political advantage, who spent 20 years ruling through fear. You're going to lecture me about choice. No. I'm going to tell you I was wrong, that I built a kingdom on the same foundation you're defending, and it almost destroyed everything I actually cared about. So what changed? Her. Torsten's eyes found Harriet. She was watching him, eyes bright with something that might have been tears, might have been hope. She walked away because I couldn't see past the crown, because I chose power over partnership. And losing her taught me something my father never learned, that strength without humanity is just brutality, that control without trust is just fear, that all the power in the world means nothing if you're too empty to appreciate what you've achieved. The words hung in the air, raw, exposed, everything the Alpha King wasn't supposed to admit. But Torsten was done performing, done pretending that certainty was the same as wisdom, that dominance equaled leadership. He was just a man, standing in ruins, trying to save the woman he loved while offering redemption to enemies who had every reason to kill him. And if that wasn't enough, if the truth couldn't cut through years of conditioning and blind obedience, then he'd die, and the kingdom would continue. And maybe someone else would figure out how to build something that actually lasted. Corvain was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was different, quieter, almost hesitant. What are you actually offering? Partnership. An alliance built on genuine mutual benefit instead of leverage and threats. Blackwater has resources, naval power, trade routes, things my kingdom needs. And we have stability, agricultural surplus, craftsmanship, things your kingdom could use. We can build something that serves both our people, or we can destroy each other fighting over scraps. And Vorenus faces trial for what he did. The bombing, the conspiracy, the invasion planning. If he's found guilty, he pays the price. If somehow he's innocent, he goes free. But you don't get to use an innocent woman as leverage to avoid accountability. The commander looked at his soldiers. They were watching him, waiting for orders. But their expressions had shifted, less certain, more thoughtful. These were men who'd followed commands their entire lives, who'd been told that obedience was the highest virtue, that questioning was weakness. But they were also men who'd seen what blind loyalty cost, who'd watched King Vorenus sacrifice people like chess pieces, who'd maybe started to wonder if there was a better way. Corvain turned back to Torsten. If I let her go, if I betray my king's orders, I'll be executed for treason. Maybe. Or maybe you'll be the man who prevented a war neither kingdom could afford, who chose peace over blind obedience, who actually built something instead of just tearing things down. I'm a soldier, not a diplomat. You're a human being, with agency, with choice, with the ability to decide what kind of man you want to be when you look back on this moment. The silence stretched, seconds feeling like hours. The entire world balanced on a knife's edge. Then Corvain raised his hand, gestured to his soldiers. Release her. The men hesitated, looked between their commander and each other, years of training screaming at them to follow the original orders. But Corvain's voice was steady when he repeated himself. Release her. That's an order. The soldiers moved, cut Harriet's bonds, removed the gag, stepped back. She stumbled, caught herself, looked at Torsten with eyes that held everything they'd never said to each other. And then she ran, not away from the ruins, toward them, toward him. She crashed into his chest with force that staggered them both, arms wrapping around him like she could somehow absorb him into safety through sheer will. "You stupid, reckless, impossible man," she whispered against his chest. "You came alone, into a trap, to save me. What else was I going to do? Live, rule, build the kingdom you promised. Let me be the cost of doing what was necessary. No, never again. I'm done sacrificing people I love for crowns and kingdoms and the appearance of strength." Torsten held her, felt her heartbeat against his chest. Steady, strong, alive, and understood with devastating clarity that this was what mattered. Not empires, not power, not monuments to control. This, connection, the choice to value one life enough to risk everything. His father had never understood that. Had seen people as tools or threats. Had died alone because he'd never learned that vulnerability wasn't weakness. But Torsten had learned, finally. After 40 years and countless mistakes and nearly losing everything, he'd learned that the strongest thing a man could do was admit he didn't have all the answers, was choose partnership over dominance, was build something based on trust instead of fear. Behind them, Corvain watched. His expression was complex. Might have been regret. Might have been something else. "What happens now?" the commander asked quietly. "Now you decide. You can go back to Varenus, tell him what happened, face whatever consequences that brings, or you can come with us, testify about the conspiracy. Help build something better than what you've been serving. That's treason. That's choice. Same thing I offered my own council. Same thing I'm offering you. And if I choose wrong, then you face the consequences. Same as everyone else. But at least you'll have chosen. At least you'll know that your life was yours instead of just an extension of someone else's ambition." Corvain was quiet for a long moment. Then he turned to his soldiers. "Anyone who wants to return to Blackwater, go. No judgment, no consequences from me." The men looked at each other, uncertainty clear on their faces. Then, one by one, they lowered their weapons, stepped forward, choosing for themselves, for the first time in careers built on following orders, choosing to believe that maybe there was something better than blind obedience. "We'll testify," one of them said. His voice was rough, uncertain. "If it means building something that doesn't require us to become monsters." Torsten nodded. "Then let's go home." The return to the capital took 2 days. They traveled slowly, carefully, because trust was still fragile, still new, the kind of thing that could shatter if pushed too hard. Harriet rode beside Torsten, neither of them speaking much. Too much had happened. Too much still needed to be processed. But her hand found his in the darkness of the first night, fingers interlacing with a certainty that felt like home. "I meant what I said," she murmured, "about needing 6 months of proof. I know, but I also need you to understand something. What you did back there, choosing to negotiate instead of just overpowering them, offering partnership instead of demanding submission. That's the man I walked away hoping you'd become. So I have a chance. You've always had a chance. The question was whether you'd take it. And now we see if you can actually build what you promised, not just survive crisis, but fundamentally change how you approach power." The challenge was clear, daunting, the kind of long-term commitment that required constant vigilance and willingness to fail. But for the first time in 20 years, Torsten wanted it. Not because it was duty, not because the kingdom required it, but because it was right. Because it was the only way to build something that could actually last. They reached the capital at dawn, rode through gates that had witnessed countless arrivals and departures, moments that had shaped kingdoms. The council was waiting, assembled in emergency session, because word had spread. Rumors of the king riding alone into danger, of soldiers defecting from Blackwater, of everything changing. Torsten entered the chamber without ceremony, Harriet at his side, Corvain and his men behind them. The crowd murmured, shocked, uncertain what any of this meant. Lady Saren was the first to speak. Her voice was carefully neutral. "Your Majesty, we heard reports, conflicting accounts. Perhaps you could clarify." I went to save Harriet. Torsten's voice was steady, clear. I was willing to trade myself, to sacrifice the crown, to do whatever was necessary. But Commander Corvain chose differently, chose to release her without demands, chose to testify against the conspiracy he'd been serving, because I offered him the same thing I'm offering all of you. Choice. The ability to decide what kind of kingdom we want to build. Lord Brennick stood. His face was red, jowls quivering. This is madness. You're allowing enemy soldiers into our council chamber, trusting people who were sent to kill you. I'm trusting people who chose to do the right thing even when it cost them everything. Torsten's eyes swept the chamber. Same thing I'm asking all of you to do, to choose, between the kingdom we've had and the kingdom we could build. And what's the difference? Someone called out. One is built on fear, on control, on the understanding that power flows from the top down and everyone else exists to serve. The other is built on partnership, on trust, on the belief that people are stronger when they choose to stand together instead of being forced to kneel. The first one worked for 3 generations, created stability, order, an empire that endured. But it also created isolation, brittleness, the kind of foundation that crumbles the moment the strong man at the top falters. I've been that strong man for 20 years, and I'm telling you it's not enough. It's never been enough. We need something better. Murmurs rippled through the assembly. Arguments, agreements, the normal chaos of people processing new ideas. Lady Saren spoke again. And if we choose this new path, if we commit to building something different, what does that actually look like? It looks like accountability, kings who can be questioned, councils that represent actual people instead of just inherited power, northern valleys with voices, Blackwater soldiers who chose peace getting genuine chances to rebuild. It looks like being willing to fail, to admit mistakes, to change course when we're wrong. It looks like being human instead of performing strength. The chamber was silent, every person processing what they'd just heard, the implications, the massive shift in everything they'd known. Then Kael stood. The northern representative's voice was rough. We came here weeks ago expecting to be dismissed, to be told that our voices didn't matter, that central authority knew better. Instead, we found a king willing to listen, willing to admit he didn't have all the answers, willing to risk everything for what was right. The North stands with this vision, stands with building something better. One by one, others rose. Not everyone, not even most at first, but enough. Enough to matter. Enough to suggest that maybe this wasn't madness, maybe it was possibility. The vote took hours. Debate, arguments, the messy process of people trying to figure out how to build something new from the ashes of everything they'd known. But ultimately, the council agreed. New principles, new structures, a kingdom built on partnership instead of domination. It would be hard, would fail sometimes, would require constant vigilance and willingness to course correct. But it was a beginning. The session adjourned, lords and ladies filing out with expressions ranging from hope to terror to calculation. Harriet found Torsten in the gardens afterward, late afternoon, light slanting golden through the trees. He was sitting on a stone bench, crown beside him, just staring at nothing and everything. She sat down, close enough to feel his warmth, far enough to give him space if he needed it. "How does it feel?" she asked quietly. "Completely changing the foundation of everything you've built. Terrifying." Torsten's voice was raw, like standing at the edge of a cliff and choosing to jump because staying still means dying slowly, but also right. More right than anything I've done in 20 years, even if it fails. Even then. Because at least I'll fail trying to build something worth having instead of succeeding at maintaining something that was already broken. Harriet's hand found his, fingers interlacing with the same certainty as the night before. "I'm not staying because of the crown," she said. "Need you to understand that. I don't want to be queen, don't want the performance, the expectations, the weight. I know, but I'll stay if you're actually committed to this, to being human, to building something together instead of offering me a place in your empire. I'm committed. To you. To this. To figuring out how to be the kind of man who deserves what he has instead of just taking it. Prove it." The challenge hung in the air, clear, uncompromising. And Torsten realized that this was it, the real test. Not crisis, not dramatic gestures, but the long, hard work of actually changing, of choosing partnership every day, of being willing to fail and try again and never stop trying. His father had never understood that, had thought kingdoms were built in singular moments of triumph, grand gestures that prove strength. But Torsten was learning, finally, that kingdoms were built in 1,000 small choices, in daily decisions to trust over control, to listen over command, to be vulnerable instead of invincible. How do I prove it? He asked. By waking up every morning and choosing me, choosing us. Choosing the kind of life that isn't defined by crowns or empires or what other people expect. I can do that. Can you? Because I've seen how seductive power is. How easy it becomes to slip back into old patterns when things get hard. Which is why I need you. To call me out when I'm wrong. To challenge me when I'm certain. To remind me that being human is more important than being right. That's a lot of pressure. That's partnership. Torsten turned to face her fully. I'm not asking you to fix me. I'm asking you to stand beside me while I do the work of fixing myself. And if you can't, if the patterns are too deep, if the crown is too heavy, then we fail, together, and figure out what comes next. Harriet was quiet for a long moment, studying him with eyes that saw everything, the scars, the mistakes, the potential. Then she smiled, small, genuine, the kind of expression that felt like sunrise after a long night. 6 months, she said. We try for 6 months, build something, see if it holds, and then we decide. Deal. They sat in the garden as the sun set. Two people who'd found each other, lost each other, and somehow found their way back. Not through